I went on a solo camping trip in the summer of 2019. I was 34 then, living in Colorado Springs and working a desk job that was slowly draining the life out of me. I had started getting stress headaches and waking up at 3 a.m. most nights for no reason. I felt like I needed to reset my brain, so I decided to take a week off work and head into the San Juan Mountains for a bit of solo time with nature. I'd camped plenty of times before, but mostly in groups. This time, I wanted to go alone. I wanted the quiet. The plan was to hike out about 10 miles from any main trail and set up a base camp near one of the remote alpine lakes I'd seen on topographic maps. I drove out on a Monday morning, packed heavier than usual since I knew I wouldn't have anyone else to lean on. I had a satellite messenger, 2 knives, water purification tablets, bear spray, a first aid kit, a 2-person tent for extra space, and food for about 7 days. I also brought a solar charger for my GPS and a flare gun just in case. I figured I wouldn't need it, but I liked being prepared. The hike to the spot I'd picked took a little longer than I thought. I parked near a ranger station, filled out a backcountry form, and started hiking around 11 a.m. The first few miles were easy. Well-marked trails, good weather, light wind. I passed 2 other hikers in the first hour and then no one after that. By the time I got near where I wanted to camp, it was around 6 p.m. and I was exhausted. The altitude gain had worn me out more than I expected. I hadn't trained like I should have. The spot I picked to set up my tent was just below the tree line, about a half-mile east of a glacier-fed lake. There was a slight incline where I pitched the tent, but I managed to make it work. It had a good view of the ridgeline to the west and enough tree cover for some shade in the morning. No obvious signs of bears or big animals, and I saw a few deer prints near the edge of a small creek nearby. I boiled some water, rehydrated a bag of chili, and ate while watching the sun drop behind the mountains. I felt calm. I even remember thinking it was the first time in months I hadn't looked at my phone out of habit. There was no signal, of course, just silence and wind. The first night went fine. It got colder than I thought it would. Probably dipped into the low 30s, and I had to wrap an extra layer around my feet to keep warm, but I slept all right. I woke up a few times to weird noises outside the tent. Twigs snapping, wind blowing through branches, but nothing unusual. Forests sound louder when you're alone. I reminded myself of that. Every little rustle sounds like a bear when you're by yourself. The second day, I hiked around the lake, took pictures, made notes in a small journal I'd brought. I saw a fox on the far end of the water, its tail huge and bushy like a cartoon. I also spotted a half-collapsed old fire ring near the base of a boulder about a mile south of my camp. Someone else had camped there before, maybe years ago. The stones were mossy and the ash had been washed out by snow or rain. Still, it made me feel a little less isolated, just knowing someone else had been there at some point. That night, I made pasta over the little stove and sat under the stars for an hour before crawling into the tent. I left the rain fly off so I could see the sky through the mesh. Around midnight, I woke up needing to pee. I pulled on my boots and headlamp, unzipped the tent, and stepped out. The stars were incredible, but what really caught my attention was how quiet it was. Not just quiet, still. No wind, no bugs, no rustling, just this strange, thick silence. After I relieved myself near a tree about 20 yards from camp, I turned to head back and caught a glimpse of something. A shape, about 40 feet up the hill. It was standing still between 2 trees, not moving. I froze. My headlamp beam didn't quite reach it clearly, but it looked too tall to be a deer and too narrow to be a bear. My first thought was a moose, but it wasn't moving at all, just standing there. I raised the light and tried to focus on it, but the second I moved, the shape stepped behind a tree and vanished. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, heart pounding, waiting to see if it would reappear. Nothing. I backed slowly toward the tent, not turning away from the slope. Once inside, I zipped everything up, including the fly, and grabbed the bear spray. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I just lay there, gripping the canister, listening for footsteps. When the sun came up, I crawled out of the tent and checked the area. I didn't see tracks, but the pine needles and dry leaves on the ground weren't great for preserving prints anyway. I told myself it was a deer or maybe even a human shadow my mind twisted into something else. That's what I wanted to believe. But it made me nervous enough to decide I'd pack up and hike closer to the main trail. Not all the way back to the car, but just a few miles in. I didn't like the idea of staying put after seeing that. Something about it just felt wrong. I spent the next hour packing, eating a rushed breakfast, and filtering more water for the hike back. I started walking around 9 a.m. and aimed to reach a campsite I'd passed 2 days before. Flatter, more open, and closer to other hikers, just in case. About an hour into the hike back, I started noticing small things out of place. A small stack of rocks balanced on a log that hadn't been there before. A stick with what looked like some kind of twine tied around the end, stuck upright in the ground. I didn't touch any of it, just kept walking. But my nerves were frayed. By midday, I made it to the spot I'd aimed for. A wide clearing with some old fire rings and a little stream nearby. I set up the tent again, took a short nap, then tried to relax, read, and cook some food. But I couldn't get comfortable. I kept thinking about that figure I'd seen. I started second-guessing whether I should have stayed out here at all. That night was colder again, and I fell asleep with the rain fly zipped up tight. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of branches breaking, not snapping like under an animal's weight, more like someone deliberately stepping on them. It wasn't close, maybe 50 yards off, but it wasn't random. I lay there holding my breath, listening. The steps came slowly, one after another. Then they stopped. 10 minutes passed. Nothing. Then another step. Closer this time. I turned off my headlamp. I didn't want anything outside to know I was awake. I reached again for the bear spray. I stayed still for maybe half an hour. Eventually, the steps faded away. I didn't hear them again, but I didn't sleep either. When morning came, I got out and walked the area. This time I found something. A piece of fishing line, the clear, nearly invisible kind tied between two trees at about knee height, maybe 20 feet from the tent. It was strung so that if I'd walked in that direction in the dark, I would have tripped. I cut it and looked around for more. I didn't find any others, but that was enough. Someone else was out here. Someone who wanted me to trip over a line in the woods. That was enough for me. I packed everything as fast as I could, barely eating, just forcing down some trail mix. I hiked out that day, all 10 miles. My legs were shaking, and I had to stop a few times to breathe. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way. I didn't see anyone. No other hikers, no shadows, nothing. But I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. I even turned around once, fast, hoping to catch someone in the act. Nothing, just the wind. By the time I reached my car at the trailhead, it was almost 5 p.m. I threw my pack in the back, locked the doors, and just sat there for 10 minutes before starting the engine. On the drive back to Colorado Springs, I kept checking the rearview mirror like I expected someone to be following me down the mountain. I never filed a report. I didn't know what to say. Someone strung fishing line near my tent wasn't exactly proof of a crime, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I've camped since then, but never alone. Never that far from people. And I never leave my tent at night without a light and a knife in hand. I still think about that first figure I saw on the hill, tall, unmoving, watching. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was someone who didn't want me there. I don't know what their plan was, but I do know I got out before they had the chance to try anything worse. I trust my instincts now. If something feels off in the woods, it probably is. And next time, I won't wait until I find tripwires to get the hell out. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to take a solo camping trip through northern Idaho. I was 31 then, working a desk job in Missoula, Montana. I had been burned out from too many weeks behind a screen and wanted to get away from everything. No phone, no emails, no one talking to me. Just quiet, just space. I needed it more than I had realized. I had done a lot of camping in my 20s, mostly with friends. But over the past few years, things changed. People moved away, started families, got busy. I didn't mind being alone. In fact, I had started to enjoy the quiet a lot more than I expected. So when I got 3 days off work, I packed up my backpack, grabbed my gear, filled my cooler, and drove west. The spot I had in mind was near a small lake called Kettle Ridge Lake. It wasn't marked on most maps, and the trails were unmaintained. I had read about it on an old hiking forum years ago and saved a GPS coordinate. It was deep in the woods, maybe 2.5 hours from the nearest gravel road. That meant no campers, no hikers, no sounds except the wind and birds. It was exactly what I needed. I left my car at the edge of a rough forest road around 2 p.m. on a Thursday. The sun was bright, the air warm but not hot. The trail was overgrown in places, but the GPS helped me stay close to the right direction. I carried a large hiking backpack, maybe 40 pounds, with food, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a camp stove, water filter, flashlight, extra batteries, knife, and a first aid kit. I also had a sidearm with me, an old revolver, just in case I ran into bears. I had no plans to use it and hoped I wouldn't even have to think about it. The hike took longer than I expected. The trail disappeared often, and I had to stop and figure out my route. I stepped over fallen logs, thick brush, and once nearly slipped down a slope slick with pine needles. By the time I got to the lake, the sun was getting low. It was more beautiful than I remembered. A small, still lake surrounded by tall pine trees, the water like glass, reflecting the orange light of the evening sun. There wasn't a single sign of human activity around it. No fire rings, no trash, no footprints. Felt like I had discovered it for the first time. I found a flat spot about 20 feet from the shore, cleared out some debris, and pitched my tent. I set my pack down, pulled out my little folding chair, and sat with my boots off, watching the lake. The silence was perfect. No engine sounds, no buzzing lights, no chatter. Just wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. That night, I made pasta on my camp stove, ate slowly, and cleaned up carefully to keep food smells away from my tent. I hung my food bag high up in a tree a good distance away. It was a habit I had learned years ago, and I never skipped it. When I crawled into my sleeping bag, I was exhausted but calm. I fell asleep fast. Somewhere deep into the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had woken me at first. I checked my watch. It was just past 2 a.m. Everything was still. I listened for a while. I could hear wind moving gently through the trees, the faint creak of branches, maybe the sound of water shifting. Nothing out of place, but I couldn't fall back asleep. Something felt off. I can't explain it. The kind of feeling where your brain is trying to tell you something, but it can't quite put it into words. Like the air was too still, like I was being watched. I told myself I was overreacting. I had read enough stories about people scaring themselves in the woods, especially when they were alone. I unzipped the tent just a little, peeking outside. The night was dark, but the moon was out, casting a silver glow over everything. I didn't see anything unusual. No movement, no sound. Eventually, I laid back down and forced myself to sleep. The next morning felt normal again. I got up, stretched, and boiled water for coffee. I walked down to the lake and splashed cold water on my face. The air was clean and cool, and everything seemed fine. Still, I kept thinking about that weird feeling from the night before. After breakfast, I took a short hike around the edge of the lake. It wasn't huge, maybe a 25-minute walk all the way around if you didn't stop. I took my time, moving slow, looking at tracks in the mud, picking up sticks, tossing stones. I found a set of deer tracks near the far end, and what looked like raccoon prints near the shore. Back at camp, I read for a while, wrote in my little notebook, ate a sandwich, and dozed in my chair under the sun. But then I noticed something strange. There were marks in the dirt near the tree where I had hung my food. Not animal prints, just shallow disturbances in the pine needles, like something had been dragged or shuffled. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. I had walked all around that tree when I hung the bag and would have noticed. The bag itself was still hanging. It didn't look disturbed, but the marks were there. They circled the tree a few times, then stopped. I looked around. No sign of anything. I stood still for a long time, listening. Nothing but birds and wind. Still, the hairs on my arms were standing up. I walked in wider circles around the camp after that, looking for more signs. I didn't find any, but for the rest of the day, I kept turning around, expecting to see something. I couldn't shake the feeling. That night, I went to sleep with the revolver a little closer to me, just beside my sleeping bag. I woke up again around 2:30 a.m. This time I knew what had woken me. There was a sound outside my tent. A soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. Then another. I didn't move. I just lay there listening, heart pounding. Another step. Then silence. I slowly, quietly reached for the revolver, keeping it under my sleeping bag. I didn't unzip the tent. I just listened. For maybe 10 minutes, everything stayed quiet. Then, off in the woods to the east, I heard a branch snap. Then another crunch. Then silence again. It wasn't an animal. I knew how animals moved. I had heard bears, elk, coyotes. This was different. This was slow, careful, deliberate. I stayed awake the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I got out of the tent and looked around. Nothing. No prints. No signs. But I felt it. Something had been out there. I thought about packing up and leaving, but a part of me didn't want to be scared off. I told myself maybe it was just a deer, maybe even another person hiking, maybe someone else had found the lake. That wouldn't be impossible. I wasn't the only one with a GPS and a map. But deep down, I didn't believe that. Still, I stayed one more night. I don't know why. Maybe it was pride. Maybe I just wanted to believe everything was fine. I built a fire that night, even though I hadn't planned to. Just something to make me feel more secure. I sat close to it, watching the woods. I didn't cook anything, just ate cold food and kept my head on a swivel. The forest was too quiet. When I went to sleep, I left the tent half unzipped so I could hear better. I kept my boots on and the revolver in my hand, under the sleeping bag. I didn't fall asleep until after midnight. I woke up to the sound of something brushing against the side of the tent. Not a step, not a branch, a soft drag, like a hand, or fabric. I froze. My chest was tight, couldn't breathe. I waited, then I heard it again. A slow drag, right next to me, then it stopped. I pulled the gun out from under the bag and held it tight. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Then I heard a single step, then nothing. I stayed like that for over an hour, sweating, shaking, my eyes locked on the edge of the tent. When the first light broke through the trees, I finally moved. I packed up fast, threw everything into my bag, stuffed the tent in half folded. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I didn't stop to check anything. I just walked. I didn't even follow the GPS. I just moved southeast until I hit the trail I came in on. It took me 5 hours to get back to the car. My legs were cramping. I was drenched in sweat. I never looked back. When I got to the car, I drove until I was out of the forest, then pulled over and just sat there. I don't know who was out there, but someone was watching me. Someone walked through my camp. Someone dragged their hand or something across my tent. I never heard a voice, never saw a face, but I know what I felt. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. I've gone camping again since then, but never alone. Never in a place that far out. I still love the woods. I still love the silence. But I know now that silence can hide things. Things that move without sound. Things that wait, that watch. And that's something I'll never forget. I went camping alone in the fall of 2022. I was 34 then, working a remote IT job that allowed me to take time off here and there, and I needed a break from everything. I'd just gotten out of a long relationship, and I was tired of looking at screens all day. The trip was meant to clear my head. My plan was to spend 4 days in northern Vermont, deep in a forested area near the Canadian border. The spot I picked was around the Belvedere Mountain area, about 2 miles off any marked trail. I found it on an old hiking forum where someone mentioned a quiet clearing near a shallow creek. No signs of people, no traffic. That sounded perfect. I packed everything myself. Tent, sleeping bag, bear canister, jet boil, dehydrated meals, water filter, map, compass, first aid, extra layers, even a satellite beacon in case something went really wrong. I'd done plenty of solo trips before, so I wasn't nervous. I liked being alone out there. No cars, no buildings, just trees and weather and time moving a little slower. The hike in was hard but not bad. I parked at a small turnout and bushwhacked for a while. It was quiet except for the sound of leaves crunching under my boots and the wind pushing through the trees. The forest was damp, the kind of damp that sinks into your clothes and stays there. It had rained a couple days earlier, so everything smelled like wet bark and moss. By the time I reached the clearing, it was almost 4 p.m. The sun was low behind the hills, painting the treetops orange. The spot was perfect. A flat open space with enough room for my tent, about 20 feet from the creek. The trees thinned just enough to let in light but still gave cover. There were no signs of previous campers, no fire rings, no trash, not even footprints. That always gave me a weird sense of pride, like I was stepping into a place nobody had touched in years. I set up the tent, filled my water bottles, boiled some water, and ate a simple meal, beef stew from a pouch and a protein bar. It was already chilly by dusk, and the sound of the creek made everything feel peaceful. I didn't bring a book this time, didn't bring anything for entertainment. I wanted to sit in the silence and let my brain settle. That first night was uneventful. I heard the usual sounds, wind, creaking branches, maybe an owl. I was warm enough in my sleeping bag. When I woke up around 2 a.m. to pee, the forest was so dark it was like standing in ink. I could barely see my hand even with my headlamp. It felt more closed in at night, like the trees moved a little closer when the sun went down. But nothing felt wrong. The second day started fine. I made coffee by the creek and followed the flow upstream for a few miles just to explore. I didn't bring my pack, just a water bottle, knife, and the beacon in case I twisted something. I found some animal tracks, probably deer or maybe a moose, but no real signs of anything big nearby. The air smelled clean. The sky was clear. I sat on a rock for a while and just listened to nothing. When I got back to camp around 3 p.m., I noticed something strange. One of my tent stakes was loose. It wasn't pulled all the way out, but it was definitely not tight like I'd left it. I stared at it for a second, trying to remember if I'd rushed that part. Maybe I hadn't driven it in all the way, but I usually double-check my setup. I pushed it back in and moved on. Later that evening, I cooked again, ate by the creek, and felt a little more uneasy than I had the first night. Not scared exactly, just watched. I told myself it was just being alone getting to me. That's normal. Your brain tries to fill in the silence with nonsense sometimes. I zipped up for the night and forced myself to ignore the feeling. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside the tent. It wasn't an animal. I knew that immediately. It was too slow, too deliberate. A faint crunch, then silence. Another crunch, then nothing. My heart started pounding. I laid there completely still. I couldn't hear breathing, and I didn't hear any snuffling or scratching like you might with a raccoon or a bear. It was just footsteps, light ones maybe 20 feet away. One, then a pause. Another, then stillness. I didn't move. My arms were cold outside the bag, but I kept my hand near my knife. I didn't unzip the tent or turn on a light. The steps stopped after a while. I laid there for over an hour, listening to my heartbeat in my ears. Eventually, I fell asleep again out of sheer exhaustion. In the morning, I stepped out carefully and looked around. Nothing obvious had changed. No prints I could see. Nothing taken. I walked a slow circle around the area. I even checked the trees, thinking maybe a branch had fallen and tricked me. But I'd been awake. I knew what I heard. I told myself it was an animal. Maybe a deer. Maybe I imagined it. Either way, I decided I'd leave the next morning, a day early. Something about the place had shifted for me. It no longer felt like I was alone. That third day, I stayed near camp. I packed up some of my gear just to save time in the morning. I kept my knife on me all day and carried the beacon in my jacket pocket. Around midday, I heard something again. Up the hill, maybe 100 yards from camp, a single snapping branch. Then nothing. I waited, looked, listened. I didn't see anything. I climbed up the hill quietly and looked around. Nothing. Just trees and ferns and scattered light. That night, I didn't cook. I ate a protein bar and sat with my back to a tree, watching the forest as the sun dropped. The silence felt heavy now, not peaceful. Every gust of wind made me jump. I stayed up until midnight, then crawled into the tent and laid there with my knife in my sleeping bag. At some point, I drifted off, and then I woke up suddenly. No noise, no reason, just fully awake. I looked at my watch. 2:38 a.m. I held my breath, straining to hear something, anything. The forest was completely silent, not even wind. Then I felt it, air moving, a breeze across my face, but the tent was zipped. I froze. I couldn't understand it at first. The air was moving like the flap was open. I reached up slowly and felt the zipper. It was down, a few inches at least. I hadn't left it like that. I know I hadn't. I zipped it fully shut before bed. I always do. I didn't move for a long time. My heart was slamming in my chest. I finally reached over and zipped it fully shut again in the dark, then sat up, gripping my knife. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I got out fast and packed everything in 10 minutes. I didn't eat, didn't even check the creek again. I just threw everything into my pack and started hiking. I didn't even stop to check the map until I was halfway back to the car. I kept looking over my shoulder. I didn't see anything, but I felt it, like something was watching me, just beyond the trees. I forced myself not to run. I got back to the car by early afternoon. My hands were shaking as I opened the door. I didn't even take off my pack. I just got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. When I finally looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror, I looked like I hadn't slept in days. A week later, I went back through all my gear. My knife was scratched, not new scratches, deeper ones near the handle, like it had been scraped against something. I know I didn't do that. My bear canister had smudges on it too, like fingerprints but not clean ones, like something greasy had touched it, human-shaped. I didn't report it. Who would I even tell? There was no crime, no damage, no proof. But I know what I heard. I know what I felt. Someone was out there. They were watching me, maybe even inside my tent while I slept. I haven't gone camping alone since. Not because of fear exactly. More because I realized something out there that I can't forget. You can plan, you can prepare, but you never really know who else is in the woods with you. Not animals. People. People who know the forest better than you do. People who don't want to be found. And if they don't want to be found, they won't be. It was early September when I decided to take a weekend camping trip by myself, looking for some time away from everything. I had been feeling burnout lately. Work, life, everything just piling up, and I needed to recharge. I found a quiet spot deep in the woods, near a small lake, tucked away from the usual tourist routes. The kind of place where no one else would bother to go, and that's exactly what I wanted. I didn't even tell anyone where I was going, thinking I'd be perfectly fine by myself. The plan was simple. I'd set up camp, enjoy a couple of days away from the noise, and return refreshed. I had my tent, some food, and my trusty old camping gear. I'd done this before, but never in a place quite so remote. The nearest town was about 20 miles away, and the nearest campsite maybe a dozen miles. The lake was surrounded by dense trees, making it feel like it was cut off from the rest of the world. The perfect escape. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already beginning its slow descent into the horizon. The air had a crisp bite to it, but nothing unbearable. I parked my truck near the entrance of the trail and started walking with my backpack, the heavy weight of it resting against my shoulders. The trail wasn't too bad, nothing too steep, but it wasn't well maintained either, which only added to the sense of isolation. I was following a faint path that wound its way through the thick woods, the trees growing closer together the farther I went in. The silence around me was almost oppressive, like the woods were holding their breath. After about an hour of walking, I found a small clearing by the lake. It was peaceful, and there was something soothing about the stillness of the water. The whole place felt suspended in time. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, my mind drifting with the sound of the wind rustling the leaves overhead. The evening stretched on, and I cooked a simple meal over the campfire I'd built. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped a little, but it wasn't uncomfortable. I felt that strange sense of calm that only comes when you're completely alone, cut off from everything. By the time it was dark, the fire had died down to embers, and I was sitting in front of it, watching the flickering red glow. I had my lantern on, casting soft light around the camp. The night was still, too still, like the world was holding its breath. The air had that cool, earthy smell of damp leaves and pine trees. But as I sat there, a sense of unease began to creep in. It wasn't anything I could point to, but something in the air felt off. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I'd been out in the woods before, alone, plenty of times. But tonight, there was a lingering feeling I couldn't shake. A weight, a quiet watchfulness. I finished eating and lay back in my sleeping bag inside the tent, trying to push the feeling aside. The night was alive with the sounds of nature, the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush, the distant hoot of an owl, the occasional splash of something jumping in the lake. But it wasn't just the normal sounds of the woods that kept my mind alert. It was something else, a subtle disturbance that gnawed at me from the edges of my awareness. I closed my eyes, trying to sleep, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept hearing something moving around the camp. Footsteps, or at least what sounded like footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible at first, but when they continued for several minutes, my heart began to race. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some small creature roaming around, but something about it didn't sit right. The sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. I lay there in the dark, holding my breath, straining to hear. The sound stopped. I waited. Nothing. After what felt like an eternity, I finally allowed myself to relax, convincing myself it was nothing. But then it started again. The soft shuffling, moving around the edge of the camp. Closer now. I sat up slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. I grabbed the flashlight beside me and clicked it on, shining the beam through the thin fabric of the tent. Nothing. The woods were silent again. The beam of light caught the faintest movement in the trees across the clearing, but there was nothing visible. I felt my stomach drop. What the hell was that? I grabbed my knife from the gear bag, just for safety, of course, and sat there listening. The silence pressed in, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I was imagining things, but the feeling, the sensation of being watched, was stronger than ever. I finally decided to check things out. I stepped outside the tent, the cool night air biting at my skin. The fire was down to a few glowing embers, and the moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. Everything seemed normal, but I knew something wasn't right. I walked quietly around the camp, my flashlight scanning the area. The ground was soft, and I noticed something strange. Footprints. They were fresh, clear in the dirt, just a few feet away from my tent. Barefoot tracks. They weren't animal prints, they were too large, too round. A human? My heart pounded as I crouched down to get a closer look. I took a step back, the weight of the situation settling over me. Someone else was here. Someone had been circling my camp. My breath came in sharp gasps as I stood frozen, trying to make sense of it. Why hadn't I heard them approach? Why hadn't they made any noise until now? I went back to the tent and grabbed my phone, checking the signal. Nothing. Of course, there wouldn't be any service out here. I tucked it away, trying to calm myself, telling myself I was just freaking out. But that didn't stop the fear crawling up my spine. The night dragged on, and I didn't sleep at all. Every crack of a branch, every rustle in the trees, made my heart skip a beat. I was on edge, waiting for something, anything to happen. The hours passed slowly, the darkness oppressive. By the time morning finally came, I was exhausted but relieved. The sun crept up over the horizon, and the warmth of its light brought a sense of calm. The weird feeling was still there, but now, with daylight, it seemed more manageable. I packed up my camp quickly, ready to leave, but before I did, I decided to take one last walk around the area, just to be sure. That's when I saw it. Near the edge of the woods, a figure standing still between the trees. Not moving, watching. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I couldn't make out any details, just a shadow, a silhouette, standing there watching. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. I didn't stay any longer. I packed up my stuff in record time, not caring about the mess. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. As I made my way back to the trail and to my truck, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me. When I finally reached the truck, I started the engine and didn't stop driving until I was back in the safety of town. The weird feeling didn't leave me, though. That image of the figure, standing in the trees, haunted me. I never did find out who it was or why they were there. Maybe it was just a hiker, someone else lost in the woods, or maybe it was something more sinister. But I can say one thing for sure. I haven't camped alone since. I arrived at the campsite on the outskirts of the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas, the sun barely beginning to dip behind the trees. It was the summer of 2022, and I was 32 years old. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of pine needles and damp earth clinging to everything. I'd always found peace in nature, and it had been a long time since I'd been out in the woods like this. My friends had backed out at the last minute, and I didn't want to waste the reservation, so I decided to go alone. The campsite was isolated, a small patch of land by a lake that rarely saw visitors, or so I was told. I set up my tent in the clearing, the lake visible through the trees a few yards away. There was something serene about the place, but at the same time, a sense of solitude that felt heavy, like the trees were watching. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves above me made me feel even smaller in the vastness of the forest. After getting everything settled, I pulled out my gear, gathered some firewood, and started a small campfire. The crackling of the flames was the only sound breaking the silence of the woods. As the light dimmed, the shadows of the trees grew longer, stretching out like fingers reaching for the campfire. I stared into the flames, thinking about the days ahead and how this trip was supposed to be a relaxing getaway. But there was something in the air that made it feel like the woods were hiding something from me, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I decided to take a walk before it got too dark, just to stretch my legs and get a better feel for the area. The path around the lake was narrow, overgrown in some spots, but still visible enough to follow. I walked slowly, enjoying the peacefulness of the evening. There were no sounds of animals or birds, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. As I rounded a bend in the trail, something caught my eye, a small wooden structure half hidden in the trees. It wasn't much, just a dilapidated cabin, barely standing. I approached it cautiously, curiosity getting the best of me. The wood was weathered and gray, the roof sagging under years of neglect. It didn't look like anyone had been there in ages, but something about it made me uneasy. I didn't know why, but I felt like I shouldn't go inside. I stood there for a moment, staring at the cabin. The sun was nearly gone now, the last of the light fading quickly. I decided to turn around and head back to my camp before it got too dark. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I felt a sudden chill on my neck, like someone was watching me. But when I looked around, there was nothing but the trees, dark and silent. Back at the campsite, the fire was still crackling, but the warmth of the flames didn't seem to reach me the same way it had earlier. I felt a little on edge, but I brushed it off as nothing. The night was peaceful, with the only sounds being the fire and the occasional gust of wind through the trees. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to shake the feeling of unease. I told myself it was just the isolation, just the quiet that made me feel this way. But as the night wore on, the unease didn't go away. The air grew colder, and the silence of the woods seemed oppressive. I glanced around, as though expecting something to move in the darkness. But there was nothing. The trees swayed gently, their branches creaking in the wind. The fire flickered and popped, casting long shadows on the ground. The sound of the wind became louder, almost like whispers. I shook my head and stood up to stretch, walking over to the edge of the clearing where the trees met the dark woods. I stood there for a moment, just listening. The air felt thick, and it was hard to shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was the kind of feeling you get when you're being watched, even though you can't see anyone. I turned back to the fire, deciding to turn in for the night. I had no idea that the night had only just begun. It was early September when I decided to take a break from everything: work, the constant noise of the city, and the overwhelming rush of life. I hadn't taken a real break in years, and this time, I figured a quiet camping trip in the mountains was just what I needed. It was just going to be me, my backpack, and the wilderness. I drove up to the campsite alone, a small, less-known spot in the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't on any tourist map, but I found it through a friend who had been there a few times. I was 28 at the time, still relatively young, but feeling the weight of work and constant stress on my shoulders. I needed to disconnect. The drive up was long. The road became narrower the higher I went, twisting and curving through dense trees. I couldn't help but admire the scenery. The rich green of the pines, the occasional clearing with a view of the valley below. The air was fresher here, crisp and cool as the sun began to dip behind the mountains. The kind of air that made you feel alive. When I finally arrived, I parked at the small, gravel lot just off the main road. The sign for the campsite was old and faded, but it was there, hanging from a post that had seen better days. There was a small trail leading up to the campsites a few hundred feet away. No one else was there, which suited me just fine. The thought of being alone in the middle of nowhere sounded perfect. I grabbed my gear, checked that I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and started hiking up the trail. It wasn't a long walk, maybe 10 minutes, but it felt peaceful, quiet. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I passed a couple of abandoned, overgrown campsites along the way, but nothing that made me uneasy. My campsite was in a small clearing, surrounded by trees. It was secluded enough that I wouldn't be disturbed. I set up my tent, unpacked my gear, and started a small fire to cook some dinner. The night sky was already darkening, the stars just starting to peek through. As the fire crackled, I sat on a log, eating a simple meal of canned beans and rice, enjoying the solitude. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted. The quiet was almost too quiet, if that makes sense. There was no sound of animals, no distant rustle in the trees, no birds calling out, just the occasional wind and the soft crackle of the fire. I tried not to think too much about it, convincing myself that it was normal for it to be so still in the mountains. Still, as the night wore on and the temperature dropped, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was one of those feelings you can't quite put into words, but it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After finishing my meal, I decided to take a walk. The firelight felt too close, too confining, and I wanted some air. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way away from the campsite, following the small trail that ran alongside a creek. The sound of water flowing over rocks was calming, and I allowed myself to relax a little. It wasn't long before I came across a large fallen log that crossed the creek. I climbed up onto it, balancing carefully as I crossed over. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling in the bushes behind me. I turned, thinking it was just a deer or some other animal. But then it happened again, this time louder, closer. It didn't sound like a typical animal noise, though. It was deliberate, almost as if someone or something was moving through the brush, trying to stay hidden. I froze. My heart skipped a beat as I scanned the darkness beyond the trees. But all I saw was the flickering light from my campfire, far in the distance. The sound stopped, just like that, dead quiet again. I stood there for a few minutes, my eyes straining in the darkness. My breath was shallow, and my mind started to race. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe a branch had fallen or a raccoon had gotten caught in the underbrush. I had been camping enough times to know that the woods can be full of strange noises, but the way that sound had come through the trees, so deliberate and measured, bothered me. I decided to go back to camp. The feeling in my gut told me it was time to call it a night. The trail back to the campsite felt longer than before, and every crunch of my boots on the ground sounded louder, sharper in the stillness. When I returned to the clearing, the fire was still going, but the feeling of unease hadn't gone away. I double-checked the tent, made sure my gear was still there, and sat by the fire for a little longer. I kept my eyes on the shadows in the trees, half expecting something to emerge from the dark. Nothing did, though. The night dragged on, and I eventually crawled into the tent, zipping it up tight. I didn't sleep much, though. Every creak of the tent fabric, every gust of wind, every rustling of leaves outside kept me on edge. I kept my flashlight within arm's reach just in case. The next morning, I woke up with a headache, not from the lack of sleep, but from the tension that had built up in the night. The sun was out, and it was a little warmer than the day before. I made myself some coffee, hoping the fresh air would help shake off the unease I still felt. I decided to pack up and head out earlier than planned. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe I was just being paranoid. As I packed up my gear, I noticed something strange. My fire pit. There, in the center of it, was a single rock, placed carefully in the middle of the ashes. It wasn't there last night. I was sure of it. I hadn't moved any rocks around when I made the fire. I bent down, reaching for the rock. It was cold, not warm like it should have been from the heat of the fire. It was almost as though it had been placed there after the fire had gone out. I glanced around the campsite, but nothing else seemed out of place. Still, that rock, it bothered me. I stood up, shaking my head, and tried to brush it off as my mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't help the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I finished packing my things, keeping a watchful eye on the surrounding trees. By the time I got everything together, the unease had turned into a full-on need to leave. I wanted out of there, away from whatever it was that had been lurking in the shadows. I made my way back down the trail, my footsteps quick and sharp on the dirt path. I kept expecting to hear that rustling sound again, but I never did. Still, the quiet was unnerving, like I was being followed, even though I couldn't see or hear anything. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, the path narrowing, and for the first time, the mountains didn't feel like a peaceful retreat. They felt like a trap. When I reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, and I quickly sped off, leaving the campsite and the mountains behind. I didn't look back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching me the whole time. By the time I made it back to the city, I was exhausted, physically and mentally. I hadn't seen anything that would explain the unease I felt, but I knew something had been wrong. The rock in the fire pit, the strange rustling in the night, it all felt off. I didn't know who or what had been out there, but I was sure of one thing. I wasn't going back to that campsite again. It was the summer of 2016 when I decided to take a break from the city and go camping alone. I was 29 back then, living in Louisville, Kentucky, working as a mechanic, and feeling worn out after months of long shifts and back-to-back weekends. I didn't want anything fancy or touristy. I just wanted to be away from noise, people, and the constant hum of life around me. So I planned a solo trip to the Boone National Forest. I had been there once before as a teenager with my uncle, and I remembered the dense woods, the rocky trails, and the feeling of complete isolation once you were deep enough into it. I spent the week before the trip checking all my gear: tent, sleeping bag, fire-starting kit, folding knife, flashlight, headlamp, backup batteries, portable gas stove, enough canned food and water for 3 days, a map, compass, first aid kit. I wasn't going to rely on GPS because I knew there were parts of that forest where reception just disappeared. I was cautious by nature, and I made sure everything was double-checked. I left early Friday morning. It was already warm out, high 80s, and I knew it would get hotter. The drive took just under 2 hours, most of it quiet, except for the sound of the engine and the occasional truck passing by on the highway. I parked at a small lot near a trailhead that wasn't heavily used, maybe 5 or 6 other cars there. The plan was to hike about 6 miles off one of the less maintained trails, and then set up camp by a stream I had marked on the map. The first part of the trail was easy. Well-worn dirt path, a few roots sticking out here and there, patches of sun breaking through the trees. After about 2 hours of steady hiking, I reached a fork where I left the main trail and started heading into more overgrown land. The further I went, the quieter it got. No more distant traffic, no more human voices. Just birds, the occasional squirrel darting through leaves, and the crunch of my boots on the dry ground. Around 2:30 p.m., I found a good spot near the stream. The trees opened up just enough to give me space for my tent. There were no signs of anyone having camped there recently, which was perfect. I set up the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, got a small fire pit ready, and filtered some water from the stream into my bottles. The water was clear and cold, tasted clean. After setting everything up, I sat for a while, letting the quiet settle around me. I was sweating through my shirt, so I rinsed my arms and face in the stream, then sat on a flat rock and ate a can of beans. That first night, nothing happened. I read for a while with my headlamp on, then turned in just after dark. I fell asleep listening to the hum of insects and the steady trickle of the stream. I woke up once, maybe around 3 a.m., to pee, but there was nothing strange, just the usual rustling of small animals in the underbrush. I zipped back into my tent and slept until dawn. The next day was more of the same. I followed the stream further upstream for a few hours with just a day pack, not really trying to get anywhere, just walking, enjoying the quiet. The woods got denser the further I went. Around noon, I turned back to the campsite. When I got there, I noticed something small that didn't seem right. A rock I had left on top of my backpack was now on the ground next to it. It wasn't a big thing, and it could have been nothing. Maybe it slipped. Maybe I bumped it and didn't notice. I told myself it was just something small and didn't matter, but it stuck in the back of my mind. That evening, I started my fire earlier, just to have something going before it got too dark. I sat and watched the flames for a long time, eating a cold can of chicken and crackers. It got dark fast under the trees. I stayed up a little later, maybe until 11, listening. The woods were louder at night, frogs, insects, owls. But every once in a while, I thought I heard something that didn't fit. A short, faint sound, like a quick snap, or a low thud. Could have been a branch falling, could have been a raccoon. I didn't know. I crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, turned off the light, and lay there listening. That's when I realized the normal sounds had faded. It was quiet, not totally silent, but the constant hum of insects had dulled. That kind of quiet always makes me uneasy in the woods. It's like everything else is listening to something you can't hear. I stayed awake longer than I wanted, but eventually I dozed off. I woke up with a jolt sometime later. I didn't know why. No dreams, no sound I could remember. Just that kind of sharp wake-up where your body knows something's off. I lay still, eyes open in the dark, ears straining. Then I heard it. A slow, careful crunch of leaves. Close. Not right outside the tent, but maybe 20 feet away. Not a deer. Too slow. Too careful. Then it stopped. I stayed still for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I heard nothing else. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, everything looked the same. Nothing disturbed. I made instant coffee, tried to act normal, but I kept checking over my shoulder. I thought about heading back early, but I talked myself out of it. Told myself I was being paranoid, that I just wasn't used to the silence. Around midday, I decided to walk south, toward a small ridge I had seen on the map, just to keep busy. I took my knife, a snack, and my water bottle. I was out for maybe 2.5 hours. When I got back, the tent was still there, but something was definitely wrong. One of the tent flaps was open. I was sure I had zipped it shut. I always did. I walked around it slowly, checking the ground. No footprints. The grass was flattened where I had been sleeping, but I couldn't tell if anything else had been moved. I checked my backpack. My food was still there. Nothing obvious was missing, but something was off. I sat down, staring at the open flap. That's when I saw it. A mark on the side of the tent. Small, near the bottom. Like someone had scraped it with a stick or maybe the edge of a knife. Just a little cut in the fabric. Not deep, not enough to rip through, but enough to notice. It hadn't been there before. That was it for me. I packed up my things fast, rolling up the sleeping bag and tent without caring how neat it was. I put out the fire pit, double-checked for trash, then slung the pack over my shoulders and started hiking back toward the trailhead. It was early, barely 2 p.m., and I knew I'd reach the parking lot before sunset. The hike felt longer going out. Every sound seemed too sharp. A squirrel running through leaves made me spin around. A gust of wind made me jump. I kept glancing behind me. A few miles in, I stopped to catch my breath and drink some water. I heard something again behind me, faint crack, maybe a branch. Then silence. I waited, staring into the trees. Nothing moved, but I felt watched. I walked faster after that. I didn't run. I didn't want to look panicked, but I didn't stop again. By the time I got back to the main trail, I was soaked in sweat. I reached the parking lot just after 5 p.m. My car was still there, no one else around. I threw the pack in the back, climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and sat there for a minute, breathing hard. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about that cut in the tent, the open flap, the careful, slow footsteps. The fact that nothing had been taken, nothing at all, made it worse. It wasn't theft. It wasn't an animal. It was someone watching. They hadn't rushed me. They hadn't confronted me. They just waited, observed, moved things slightly, watched me leave the site and came close enough to touch my things. That kind of patience scared me more than anything. I didn't report it. What could I say? There was no evidence, no real crime, just a feeling, a few marks, an open flap. But I knew what had happened. I never went camping alone again. I still go out sometimes with friends in places where other people are around, but never deep in the woods, never alone. I sold that tent a year later, got rid of the knife too. Sometimes I still think about it, especially when I hear a branch snap outside at night. I'll never know who it was. I don't want to know, but they were there, and they were close, closer than I'll ever be comfortable with again. /voice/speak. I went camping alone in northern Montana in the summer of 2019. It was late July and I had just turned 30. I lived in Spokane, Washington at the time, working as a freelance graphic designer, and I had the kind of schedule that allowed me to disappear for days at a time without answering to anyone. I needed a break from staring at screens and deadlines, so I planned a trip to the Kootenai National Forest. It was a rugged, quiet place, a bit off the usual tourist radar, and I liked that. I'd been up there a few times in the past, but always with friends. This was my first solo trip. I packed my Ford Escape with all the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, 2 coolers, a camping stove, my old hiking pack, and a Ruger LCP that I kept hidden in a compartment under the front seat. I never really expected to need it, but I always brought it anyway, just in case. It was more of a mental thing than anything else. I had a full tank of gas, and I left home around noon on a Tuesday, hoping to beat any weekend crowds. The drive took about 6 hours with a couple stops for gas and snacks. I got to the area near Yak River around sunset. I knew of a spot off a logging road that didn't show up on most maps. It was down a steep dirt path, not maintained anymore, but it was passable if you took it slow. That night, I just parked near the end of the path, set up my tent on a flat patch of earth beside a thick wall of trees, and cooked some beans and sausage on the stove. I didn't build a fire. There had been some talk of burn bans, and I didn't want to take chances. The forest out there is thick. Tall old pines, spruce, birch trees, moss-covered stones, and undergrowth that muffles every step. You can't hear much unless it's right near you. At night, it gets real quiet, unnaturally quiet. No traffic, no distant hum of planes or towns. Just the wind through the branches and the occasional rustle of something in the brush. I didn't sleep too well that first night. I never really do the first night of any trip, especially when I'm alone. I kept waking up to the wind and the strange quiet. Once or twice I thought I heard something heavy moving outside the tent, but it didn't come close. Might have been a deer. Montana's full of them. The next morning, I hiked up the ridge behind my site. I'd been that way once before with a friend years ago. There was a game trail that led up to a rocky clearing where you could see the valley. Took me about an hour to reach the top. The view was still as beautiful as I remembered. Endless trees, no roads in sight, just layers of green hills fading into gray-blue haze. I sat there for a while, eating jerky and drinking water, feeling pretty good about the trip so far. I didn't see another person all day. On the way back down, I thought I saw something off in the trees. A little flash of movement, maybe 50 yards away. It didn't look like an animal, more like a person ducking behind a tree. I stopped and stared in that direction for a long time, but nothing moved. Could have just been my imagination or sunlight through the branches. Still, I picked up my pace heading back down. That night, I kept my headlamp nearby and the gun in my pack, right beside the sleeping bag. I didn't sleep much again. Just as I was drifting off sometime past midnight, I heard a thump near the car. It wasn't loud, but it was solid, like someone knocking once against metal. I sat up instantly, heart thudding in my ears. I didn't turn on the light yet. I just sat still, listening. Nothing followed. After 5 or 10 minutes, I crawled out of the bag, unzipped the tent slowly, and peeked out. It was dark. Cloud cover had blocked out the moon, and everything looked like shapes pressed against other, blacker shapes. I stayed awake until the sky started to lighten, but I didn't hear anything else. The next morning, I checked around the car. Nothing obvious was out of place. No scratches or footprints that I could see, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been nearby. I decided I'd stay one more night, just one more. I didn't want to let paranoia chase me off, but something was bothering me, even if I couldn't explain it. That day, I walked farther upstream along the river, fishing a little and collecting photos of animal tracks and odd moss formations for reference. The farther I went, the more I relaxed. By mid-afternoon, I had almost convinced myself that the noises were just animals or my own jumpy mind. I didn't see anyone. No rappers, no cut branches, no signs of other hikers or campers. Back at camp, I made a real meal, fried some rice and veggies I'd brought in a cooler and boiled water for coffee. I sat on a folding chair watching the sun drop through the trees and let myself feel calm again. The quiet didn't seem so oppressive that night. I even thought I might sleep all the way through. That changed around 2 a.m. This time I heard movement. Steady, slow movement in the brush. Not directly next to the tent, but close enough. Maybe 30 or 40 feet out. I turned off my light and sat completely still. The noise wasn't frantic or loud. It wasn't an animal foraging. It sounded more like someone trying to be quiet. I strained my ears and picked up the faintest creak, like weight shifting on old wood. Took me a second to recognize it. The sound of my camp chair. I kept a small hatchet beside the tent flap. I slid it quietly into my lap. Then I heard a soft sound, almost a click, maybe something metal. That's when I finally turned on my light and unzipped the tent, aiming the beam in the direction of the chair. Nothing. The chair was still there, empty. It wasn't even moved, but something had been near it. I was sure. I stepped out, turning slowly, shining the light through the brush and trees in a wide arc. Still nothing. Then I turned toward the car. The driver's side door was open. I know I locked it. I always do. I stood frozen for a second, staring at the door hanging ajar. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. Nothing. I crept closer, half expecting someone to lunge out, but no one did. I shined the light inside. The glove box was open. The compartment under the seat, where I kept the gun, was open too. It was empty. That shook me. I backed away from the car and returned to the tent, not sure what to do next. Couldn't sleep. I just sat in the tent with the light off, gripping the hatchet in both hands. The sun couldn't come up fast enough. The first light, I packed everything. Tent, food, gear, all of it. I shoved it into the car in a rush. I didn't eat. I didn't check the river or take one last photo. I just got in and drove back up the logging path, heart pounding every time I turned a blind corner. I made it back to the highway and drove for about 2 hours before pulling into a gas station to eat and breathe for a bit. I still didn't feel right. I hadn't seen anyone, but I knew someone had been out there. Someone who watched me long enough to learn where I kept the gun. someone who got close while I slept. And the worst part was that they didn't take anything else. Not my wallet, not the keys, not the gear, just the gun. I went to the police in Troy and reported what happened. They took my statement and said they'd checked the area, but I could tell they didn't expect to find anything. The officer said maybe it was a bear, or maybe I just misplaced the gun. I didn't argue. I just thanked him and left. A week later, I got a call. They'd found my gun in a shallow creek a few miles from my site. It had no prints on it, nothing else nearby, just the gun, wrapped in a bit of plastic like someone had planned to come back for it but changed their mind. I never went back to that spot. I still camp sometimes, but only in designated areas, places with other people nearby. I keep the gun closer now, usually in my pack, always in reach. I don't sleep as deeply in the woods anymore, and I always check the car twice before I crawl into the tent. Something about that trip left a mark. Not a scar, but a scratch. Just deep enough that I feel it every time I step into a forest. And sometimes, on really quiet nights, I think about that person out there. Not someone lost or hungry, someone who crept through the dark and opened my car, who took the one thing meant to keep me safe and walked off into the woods with it. And I still wonder, were they planning to come back? Because I think they were. I went camping alone in the summer of 2022, a few months before my 32nd birthday. I had been dealing with a lot of stress from work and needed to get away from the city. I lived in Reno, Nevada at the time, and I picked a remote area in Northern California to spend a few nights. I found a spot near a place called Big Valley Mountain, far off any main road, and at least 10 miles from the nearest paved path. I didn't want campgrounds with kids or RVs. I wanted to be alone. I'd always liked the quiet, especially in the woods. I'd camped dozens of times before, always solo, and nothing bad had ever happened. I packed my usual gear, tent, sleeping bag, first aid kit, food, water, bear spray, a good knife, a solar charger for my phone and GPS device. I kept my phone in airplane mode most of the time to save power. I wasn't worried about reception out there. I didn't plan to use it unless I had to. The drive was long and bumpy once I left the highway. The dirt road got narrower the higher I went into the hills, winding between thick patches of pine and fir trees. There were no signs, just forest and silence. I reached the spot around mid-afternoon. It was a small clearing about 30 yards wide, flat ground, a fire ring made of old stones, probably used by hunters or campers years before. From there, the land sloped down sharply to the east with thick forest below. To the west, the ridge climbed higher, and I could see bare rock poking through the trees up top. I set up camp quickly. The tent went near the trees for shade, and I cleared the brush a little farther out for a fire later. I had 3 gallons of water and planned to stay 2 nights. It was dry, sunny, and hot, around 90 degrees, but cooled down fast in the evening. I made a simple dinner, some pre-cooked rice and chicken, heated over my small camp stove, and ate while watching the sun go down over the ridge. The forest was quiet except for some birds and crickets. I felt relaxed, like I was finally away from everything. That first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire until it burned down, then crawled into the tent. The wind rustled the trees, but nothing else moved. I slept well. The next morning, I got up early. I made instant coffee and ate a granola bar. After packing a day pack with water, snacks, a map, compass, and some basics, I went for a hike down the slope east of camp. It was steep, but I moved slowly. I marked trees every few minutes with orange tape I'd brought. The trail I followed wasn't really a trail, just an old game path, but I was used to that. I walked for maybe 2 hours, making note of the terrain. Fallen logs, animal prints in the dust, thick ferns in a few damp gullies. I even found a small dry creek bed that must have run with water in the spring. No people.
No trash.
No cell signal. Just deep woods. I turned back before noon. It was getting hotter and the bugs were out in force. I reached camp a little after 1 p.m. and took a short nap. Around 3, I got up to gather some more wood for the fire. I found plenty not far from camp, mostly dry branches and deadfall. As I moved through the trees, I noticed something odd. A fresh-looking set of footprints in a patch of dry dirt. Not animal, human, barefoot. That made me stop. The prints were small, smaller than mine, but the toes were deep. Someone had walked through here without shoes recently. Maybe a hiker? But who hikes this far-off trail with no shoes? I looked around. No other prints. No pack. No broken branches. No signs of anyone. Just 3 clear left-right prints in the dust and then nothing. The ground was hard nearby, and the trail disappeared. Felt weird, but not threatening. Maybe someone came through hours earlier, and I just missed them. I chalked it up to a strange hiker and went back to camp. That evening, I cooked again and watched the light fade. But this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there. I kept glancing at the woods behind my tent. Every little noise, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, made me turn. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons or deer, nothing dangerous. Still, I decided not to light a big fire that night. I kept it small and stayed close to the tent. When it got dark, I climbed into my sleeping bag and zipped the tent shut tight. I lay there for a while, listening. Nothing, just wind and the occasional insect buzz. Eventually, I dozed off. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. It was pitch black. I didn't know what had woken me. At first, I thought I dreamed something, but then I heard it again. Branches cracking. Something was moving near camp. I held my breath and listened harder. It wasn't a deer. Too slow, too careful. I unzipped the tent slowly, as quietly as I could, and poked my head out. I saw nothing. No movement. No steps. But I could hear footsteps. Soft, crunching leaves. They circled the tent once, then faded into the trees. I stayed still for a long time, maybe 20 minutes. Finally, I slipped out, holding my flashlight but not turning it on. I crouched and listened again. Nothing. The air was still. I didn't sleep much after that. Just lay there, waiting for morning. At sunrise, I got up and looked around. No prints. No disturbed brush. Nothing missing. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. That morning, I packed my gear. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I wasn't enjoying the trip anymore. Something was off. I decided to hike out early and head home. I could come back another time. It took over 2 hours to hike back to the car. I loaded my gear and got on the road. The drive out was quiet. I didn't see a single person. For the next few days, I didn't think much about it. But a week later, curiosity got the better of me, and I looked up recent news around Big Valley Mountain. I didn't expect to find anything. What I found made my stomach drop. 3 months earlier, a man in his 40s had gone missing while hiking near there. His car was found at a pull-off about 5 miles from where I'd camped. No signs of him were ever found. Just his boots, discovered deep in the forest, placed neatly next to a tree. A year before that, another man had vanished in the same general area. Also a solo camper. Also no signs of struggle, no gear found, just gone. There weren't enough cases to make headlines, and the area was remote enough that most people didn't care. The articles were short, local blogs, a few forum posts, but one detail stuck with me. In one of the posts, a search volunteer mentioned finding strange footprints barefoot in the dirt, like someone had been walking in circles near an abandoned fire ring. After reading that, I decided never to camp alone again. I still go hiking, still love the woods, but I always go with someone now, and I stick to marked trails. I don't care how remote a place is. If it feels wrong, I leave. I don't know who was out there near my camp. I never saw them, never heard from anyone else. But I know someone was there, someone who didn't want to be found, someone who moved quiet, someone who watched, and I was lucky. Not because I was brave, not because I was smart, just lucky, because I left before they got closer. That's all that saved me. I was 32 when I decided to take some time off from everything. This was back in the summer of 2019. I had spent the last 6 years working nonstop in construction management down in Austin, Texas. That year had been particularly rough. Too many deadlines, too many last-minute site changes, and a few too many people who didn't seem to care how hard I was trying to keep things together. I was burned out, plain and simple. I didn't want to sit in front of a TV or fly somewhere full of tourists. I wanted to be alone, out in the woods, just with my own thoughts and the sound of nature. That's when I decided I was going to go camping. Just me, my gear, and some peace and quiet. I picked a spot in northwestern Arkansas, in the Ozarks, a place called Devil's Hollow. I found it while flipping through an old hiking guidebook I'd bought years back but never used. The trail wasn't listed on most popular sites, which made it even more appealing. It sounded isolated and untouched. The book said it was about 8 miles from the trailhead to a flat clearing near a shallow creek where people sometimes camped. That's where I planned to set up for 3 nights. I packed light but smart tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days just in case, a compact stove, knife, flashlight, a multi-tool, first aid kit, water filtration straw, and some extra clothes. I had my phone but didn't expect service that deep in the woods, and I brought a paper map of the area too. I left early on a Thursday morning, drove up past Fayetteville, and reached the gravel pull-off near the trailhead around noon. There were no other cars around, which I liked. I parked, locked everything up, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started walking. The trail started easy, mostly flat with only a few inclines. The forest was thick, full of oaks, hickories, and maples. The air smelled clean, earthy. I passed through patches of sunlight that filtered through the trees and heard nothing but the wind and the occasional bird call. After about 5 miles, the trail got narrower and rougher, which the guidebook warned me about. I crossed a small ridge with a steep drop to one side and climbed down into a hollow. Around 4 p.m., I reached the clearing by the creek. It was a perfect spot, flat, shaded, with a soft layer of pine needles covering the ground. The creek bubbled quietly nearby, and I saw animal tracks around it. Mostly deer, maybe some raccoons. I set up my tent facing the water, changed out of my sweaty shirt, and boiled some water for one of those freeze-dried meals. As I ate, I noticed how quiet everything was. Not in a creepy way, just calm, peaceful. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that kind of silence. That night, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the faint sound of the creek and the rustling of leaves. The next morning, I woke up around 7. There was some fog clinging to the ground, but it cleared fast once the sun got up. I made coffee, sat on a rock by the water, and just let my mind wander. I walked around the area later, explored upstream a little, found a dead tree that had been gnawed down by beavers, and saw a few birds I didn't recognize. The whole day was uneventful in the best way. I didn't see or hear anyone, which reassured me that I'd picked the right place. When it got dark, I cooked again and settled into the tent with my headlamp and a book. I read for a bit before falling asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. I laid there listening. Then I heard something not close, but not far either. A branch cracking. Something heavy moving slowly through the brush. I figured it was probably a deer, maybe even a bear. I'd read that black bears were around but weren't usually aggressive if you didn't leave food out. I hadn't. Still, I sat there quietly for a few minutes, holding my breath until everything went silent again. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning, I went out to check the area around the tent. I didn't see any animal tracks close by, but I did notice something that made my stomach twist a little. About 20 feet from the tent, near a tree, the pine needles looked disturbed. Not like something had dug, but like someone or something had walked in a small circle there. The pattern wasn't natural. It was a flattened loop, about 6 feet across. I stood there staring at it for a while, trying to think of what could have caused it. I told myself maybe it was an animal pacing, or maybe I was just overthinking it. I brushed it off and went about my day. I hiked downstream for a while and found a spot with a deeper pool where I sat with my feet in the water. But the thought kept creeping back in. That loop in the needles, the crack I'd heard in the night. I didn't want to admit it, but something had felt off since I woke up. That night, I didn't fall asleep as easily. I stayed up longer, reading by my headlamp, and kept the knife within reach. I listened harder. Every sound seemed louder, more deliberate. I finally dozed off sometime after midnight. Again, I woke up in the dark. This time, I knew something was wrong the second I opened my eyes. I didn't hear the creak. I didn't hear anything. Just silence, heavy, pressing silence. I turned off the headlamp and waited. That's when I heard a snap. Then another. Closer this time. My heartbeat picked up fast, and I stayed completely still. The sound came again. Footsteps. Slow, steady, and definitely two-legged. I sat up silently, gripping the knife. My tent was zipped shut, and I didn't dare unzip it. I heard the footsteps stop. Then nothing. Just dead silence again. I waited, heart pounding so hard it was almost painful. Maybe 10 minutes passed. Then I heard one more sound. Quick, sharp, and close. A dry twig cracking right outside the tent. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. My legs started cramping from how stiff I was. But I didn't move. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light came, I finally unzipped the tent and stepped out. Everything looked normal, but I saw new tracks. Bare feet. Human. They weren't mine. I wear size 11 boots. These prints were smaller, narrow, with long toes. They came from the woods, circled my tent twice, then went back the same way they came. No shoes, just bare feet in the woods. That hit me hard. I suddenly felt very alone out there. I packed up faster than I ever have. Didn't eat, didn't even drink coffee. Just took down the tent, stuffed everything into my pack, and started back toward the trailhead. I kept looking over my shoulder the entire way. The trees looked different somehow, closer, darker. I didn't hear birds or squirrels. It felt like everything was holding its breath. Around the 4th mile back, I noticed something strange. On a tree beside the trail, about chest height, there was a mark, 3 vertical scratches, deep and fresh. I stopped and stared at them. They weren't made by a bear. They were too clean, almost like a knife. I touched them lightly, and the wood was still soft. They'd been made recently. I kept walking, faster now. My boots stomped over rocks and roots, and I didn't care about noise anymore. I just wanted out. Around mile 6, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, just a rustling behind me. When I turned, nothing was there, but I saw something hanging from a low branch. A strip of fabric, faded blue, looked like it had been torn from a shirt. It was tied in a knot around the branch. I didn't touch it. By the time I got within sight of the trailhead, my legs were shaking. I was dehydrated, tired, and on edge. My car was still there. I unlocked it, threw my gear in the back, and got inside. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone step behind a tree on the edge of the woods. No details, just a shape. I didn't stop. I drove 3 straight hours without pulling over. When I got back home, I didn't tell anyone the full story. I just said I'd cut the trip short because of bad weather. For the first few nights, I couldn't sleep. I kept checking the locks on my doors and windows. I had nightmares about the woods, about the sounds, the silence, the footprints. Weeks later, I searched online for anything about Devil's Hollow. I didn't find much, just a few mentions in old hiking forums. But one comment stuck with me. Someone wrote, asterisk, went to Devil's Hollow once back in 2004. Weird place. Felt like I was being watched. Won't go back. Asterisk. That was it. Just that. I haven't been camping since. And I won't go alone again. Not ever. Not because of animals, but because out there, deep in the woods, you might not be alone even when you think you are. I was 32 when I decided to take some time off work and go on a solo camping trip. It was September of 2022, and I'd been stuck in a cycle of long workdays, late nights, and no fresh air. I lived in a small apartment in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the walls had started to feel like they were closing in. So when I came across an old topo map of the Ouachita Mountains in Arkansas while cleaning out a drawer, I figured it was a sign. I'd camped a lot growing up, but hadn't done a real backcountry trip in over a decade. I wanted something isolated, away from campsites, trailheads, or any kind of cell service. I wanted silence. I spent a few days getting my gear in order: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, bear spray, Small first aid kit, headlamp, the usual stuff. I didn't bother with a satellite phone or GPS tracker. I'd brought a printed map and a compass, and I was confident in my navigation skills. The plan was simple. Hike in about 10 miles to a remote area near a creek I'd found on the map, set up camp for 2 nights, and hike out on the 3rd day. I parked my car on a little gravel turnout off an old forest road about 20 miles from the nearest town. I'd already filled out a backcountry permit and left a copy of my route with my brother, just in case. The hike in went smoothly. The air was warm but dry, and the trail was overgrown in places, but that's what I'd wanted, somewhere off the grid. I didn't see another person the entire time, just deer, a few wild turkeys, and what I thought was a black bear far in the distance. Nothing unusual for that part of the country. By late afternoon, I made it to the creek I'd picked out. It wasn't much more than a trickle, but it would be enough for water. I set up my tent under a group of tall pines about 20 yards from the water, on a flat patch of ground that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. There was no fire ring, no trash, no signs of previous campers. Perfect. That first night was uneventful. I made a small fire using what I'd gathered nearby, ate a dehydrated meal, and sat watching the flames until the sky turned dark and the stars came out. It was quiet. No cars, no planes, just the sound of crickets and the creek. I slept well. The next morning, I ate a protein bar, filtered some water, and decided to explore up the creek a bit. The forest here was dense, mostly pine and oak with thick underbrush. After walking about half a mile upstream, I found an old rusted-out barrel in the brush, covered in moss and half-buried in dirt. It was weird, considering how far I was from any road. I looked around but didn't see anything else man-made, so I kept going. Later that afternoon, after I'd returned to camp and rested, I started getting this weird feeling, like I was being watched. It wasn't strong at first, just an occasional prickling at the back of my neck. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I hadn't seen a soul in over a day, and isolation can mess with your head. Still, the feeling didn't go away. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard something. Not animals moving in the brush, these were sharper, more deliberate sounds. A snap of a twig, like someone stepping carefully. A low thud, not far off. I sat up in my sleeping bag and turned off my headlamp, listening. The fire had long since gone out, and the forest was pitch black. I waited, holding my breath, but eventually, the sounds stopped. I figured it was just a raccoon or maybe a coyote, but in the morning, I noticed something strange. One of my trekking poles was lying on the ground about 10 feet from where I'd left it, and my food bag, though still tied up in the tree, was swaying like it had just been pushed. There was no wind. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe a squirrel had gotten into it and jumped out. Maybe the pole had fallen over on its own. But it didn't feel right. That day, I stayed close to camp. I didn't like the idea of wandering off and coming back to find something worse. I made sure everything was packed tightly, cleaned up around the tent, and even made a few extra mental notes about the landmarks nearby in case I needed to make a fast exit. Around mid-afternoon, I heard another sound, different this time. A metallic clinking like something tapping against metal. It was faint and I couldn't tell where it came from. I stood there for a while trying to figure it out, but the forest had gone silent again. No birds, no insects, nothing. I didn't start a fire that night. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the dark with just my headlamp, writing a few notes in my little journal and listening. I heard the sounds again, closer this time. A slow crunching of leaves. A single knock against what sounded like a tree trunk. Then silence. I waited for a flashlight or the sound of a voice, but nothing came. I stayed awake almost all night, clutching my bear spray, listening. I kept thinking maybe a hunter had stumbled on my camp and was trying to scare me. Or maybe someone was squatting out here, living off-grid and didn't like visitors. But whoever it was, they were good at not being seen. The first light, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat. I didn't even bother with coffee. I just stuffed everything in my pack, checked the area to make sure I wasn't leaving anything behind, and started heading back down the way I came. I moved fast, following the creek and then picking up the faint trail I'd made on the way in. I didn't hear anything for the first hour or so, and I started to relax, thinking maybe I was in the clear. But then I saw footprints. Not animal tracks, boot prints. Big ones. They weren't there before. I was sure of it. They followed the same direction I was going, just ahead of me on the trail, and they looked fresh. The ground was still soft from rain 2 days earlier, and these prints were clean, like someone had just made them that morning. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked around, but the woods were silent again. No movement. I decided not to follow the trail anymore. I cut into the brush, moving parallel to the trail but deeper into the trees, checking behind me every few minutes. It slowed me down a lot, and my legs got scratched up from pushing through branches, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out. Around noon, I stopped to rest and eat something small. I sat on a log and drank from my water bottle, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being followed. I didn't hear anything, but the silence felt heavy, like the woods were waiting. When I got close to where I'd parked, I stayed in the trees and looked down toward the road. My car was there, right where I'd left it, but something was off. The driver's side door was ajar. I knew I'd locked it. I always double-check. I moved slowly, keeping low, watching the car from behind a tree. I waited for 5, maybe 10 minutes, but no one appeared. Finally, I crept down the slope, staying quiet. I looked through the windows. Nothing inside seemed disturbed. The door was unlocked, but nothing was missing. My wallet, which I'd stashed under the seat, was still there. My spare key was untouched. I got in, locked the doors, and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, trying to calm down. Then I started the engine and drove. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the edge of town. I went inside, bought a bottle of water, and sat outside for a while. No one followed me, no strange cars, no one watched. I never went back to that area. I told my brother what happened, but I left out a lot of the details. I didn't want to sound paranoid. I even thought about reporting it to the Forest Service, but what would I say? That I heard noises and saw footprints? They'd probably just tell me it was a hunter or another camper. Maybe it was. But whoever it was, they knew how to move quietly. They knew how to hide. And they knew I was there. What scared me the most wasn't what happened. It was what didn't happen. Whoever it was, they had every chance to confront me or worse. But they didn't. They just stayed nearby, watching, waiting, making little noises to remind me they were there. Like they were testing how I'd react. Like they'd done it before. I've done other trips since then, but I don't go alone anymore. I stay in areas with more people, more visibility. And I always lock my car. That trip reminded me that the scariest things out there aren't wolves or bears or ghosts. They're people. People who know the woods better than you do. People who don't want to be found. People who get a thrill from letting you know they're watching, without ever showing their face. That's what stuck with me the most. I never saw them, not once, but I know they saw me. I went camping alone in late October of 2019. I was 32 at the time, living in a small apartment in Springfield, Missouri. I worked remotely doing IT for a logistics company, so I had a flexible schedule. Things had been stressful that fall. My father passed away in August, and I had just gone through a breakup a few weeks later. I needed time away from everything, and being out in the woods had always helped me reset. I picked a spot in the Mark Twain National Forest, about 2.5 hours south of where I lived. It was a quiet place. Massive forest, small gravel roads, not many marked trails in the area I was heading. I found it a few years earlier while exploring on my own. There was a clearing next to a little creek that always stayed shallow, with soft mossy ground and a few fallen logs to sit on. I had camped there 3 times before and never saw another person in the area. No cell signal out there either, which was what I wanted. I loaded my SUV with the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, camp stove, some canned food, water jugs, flashlight, firewood, small hatchet, and a new hunting knife I bought the week before. I also packed extra batteries, some thick clothes, and a paperback book. I had a weather app saved offline, and it showed the weekend would be clear but cold, dropping into the 30s at night. That didn't bother me. I liked the cold. What I didn't like was people, at least not right then. I left early on a Friday morning and got to the forest around 9:30. The sky was clear and the air crisp. I rolled down the windows as I drove the last stretch on a dirt road, letting in the smell of fallen leaves and pine. Once I got to the familiar turnoff, I put the car in four-wheel drive and eased through the trees until I reached the clearing. It looked exactly how I remembered it. Quiet, a little damp, shaded by tall oaks and sycamores. The creek made its usual soft bubbling sound nearby. I didn't see any trash or tire marks, so it didn't seem like anyone else had been there recently. I parked under a big tree near the edge of the clearing and took my time setting up camp. I staked the tent near the creek, made sure it was taut and waterproofed, then set up my sleeping area inside with a thick mat and my 0-degree sleeping bag. I stacked some firewood in a dry spot, laid out my camp stove on a flat rock, and dug a small latrine behind a group of bushes. Everything was routine. I wasn't in a hurry. I had 3 full days to do nothing. The first day went exactly how I hoped. I made a late breakfast and read a few chapters of my book. I walked upstream for a while, saw some deer tracks and one old coyote den. I brought a compass and map with me just to be careful, but I never got more than a mile from camp. The forest was dense but calm, with occasional rustling from squirrels or birds. I saw no signs of other people, no rappers, no old fire pits, no boot prints. That evening, I made a fire and ate canned chili with crackers. I sat by the flames for hours, sipping hot coffee and staring at the trees. As the sky darkened, the temperature dropped fast, so I put on a wool hat and thicker jacket. I heard an owl call out a few times, and once, something small ran through the leaves not far off, probably a rabbit or raccoon. Nothing unusual. I went to bed early that night, around 9:30. The tent was zip tight, and I had a small lantern hanging from the inside top. I read a few more pages and turned it off. The sounds of the forest lulled me. Wind in the branches, the creek bubbling nearby. I slept better than I had in weeks. The next day started normal but didn't stay that way. I woke around 7:30, cold but rested. There was a thin layer of frost on the tent, and my breath fogged in the air. I boiled water for instant oatmeal and made more coffee. As I was eating, I noticed something odd near the edge of the clearing. Broken twigs, maybe a faint trail in the leaves leading deeper into the woods, opposite the creek. I assumed it was just from a deer or something passing through, but I didn't remember seeing it the day before. I walked over and took a closer look. The twigs were snapped clean, and there were marks in the dirt, too big for a deer. They looked like footprints, but not clear enough to be sure. I brushed it off. Could have been from me walking around yesterday. Still, something about it bugged me. I decided to hike a different direction that day, heading west along the creek. The air was brisk and quiet. I followed animal trails and kept an eye on my compass. Around noon, I found an old tree stand high up in a sycamore, long abandoned. I climbed partway up to look around. The forest stretched on in every direction. No roads, no clearings, no signs of people. I liked that. I stayed out for a few hours, then turned back. When I got back to camp, the air felt different. Still quiet, but heavier somehow. I checked everything. Tent was fine, gear was untouched, nothing moved. But I noticed more snapped branches in the same direction as before, and now I was sure there were prints in the leaves, boot prints. Not mine. The sole pattern was different and the stride was longer. They were faint but fresh. They came from the woods, circled halfway around my tent, then disappeared back into the trees. That made my stomach drop. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ground. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe someone had wandered through, maybe a hunter passing by, but they didn't call out. They didn't leave a note. They didn't come to say hi, which was strange for how close they got to the tent. And I hadn't heard a thing. I kept scanning the woods. Nothing moved. The sun was still a few hours from setting. I took a slow walk around the clearing, looking for more signs. I found another partial print near the creek, and some leaves disturbed on the other side of the campsite. Whoever it was had been quiet, careful. I started to feel watched. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't shake it. I kept checking behind me. I took out my knife and kept it on my belt. I didn't pack a gun. That was a mistake. I didn't cook dinner that night. I ate a protein bar and some jerky, then packed up all the loose gear and tied my food bag high in a tree. I doused the fire completely and double-checked the tent zippers. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't want to draw attention. The wind had picked up, and the trees creaked. Every snap of a twig made my skin crawl. I laid in the sleeping bag fully clothed, knife in hand, listening. Hours passed. Sometime after midnight, I heard something. It started as light footsteps. Not animals, not four-legged, soft but deliberate, moving slowly outside the tent, leaves crunching under weight. I held my breath. The steps stopped for a long time, then started again, moving to the back of the tent. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. There was a long pause. Then I heard breathing. It was faint but real, right outside the tent, deep and steady. Someone was standing inches from the wall of fabric between us. I gripped the knife tight, heart pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. The breathing continued, slow and steady. Then it stopped. Silence. I waited, every muscle tense. After what felt like an hour, I heard the leaves crunch again, this time moving away, step by step. Eventually, it faded into the forest. I didn't sleep. When dawn came, I unzipped the tent and looked around. Nothing was disturbed. No prints, no marks. The forest looked peaceful, but I knew what I heard. Someone had been there, standing over me in the dark, not trying to break in, not trying to talk, just watching. I packed up in 15 minutes. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I shoved everything into the SUV and got out as fast as I could. I checked the rearview mirror the entire drive back to the main road. I didn't see anyone. I reported it to the rangers when I got back to town. They took my statement but said they didn't have enough to go on. No injuries, no theft, no proof of anything illegal, just a scary experience. They said it could have been a lost hiker, a drifter, maybe a hunter who got too close without realizing. But I knew better. Whoever that was, they knew I was there. They circled my tent. They stood outside it in the dead of night. That wasn't someone lost. That was someone waiting. I never went back to that spot. It took me months to camp again, and when I finally did, it was in a marked campground with other people nearby. I started bringing a pistol with me after that. People think the woods are scary because of animals or ghosts or getting lost. But what really stays with you is knowing someone was out there, watching you in the dark, without a sound, without a word, just standing there, and knowing they chose to leave, for now. I went on a solo camping trip back in the summer of 2019. I was 31 at the time, living in Boise, Idaho. I'd always liked being outdoors, especially in places where I couldn't hear cars or people, where the only sounds were wind, trees creaking, and birds moving through the branches. That summer, I had a long weekend off from work and decided to head into a section of forest about 3 hours north of the city. It wasn't a national park, just public land with some fire roads and a few hiking trails. Not too many people went there because there weren't any campgrounds or amenities. That was part of the appeal. I didn't want to share the woods with anyone. I loaded my gear the night before: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, tools, first aid kit, all the usual stuff. I'd done enough trips like this to know what I needed. I had a paper map and a compass too, since I didn't plan on having cell signal out there. My plan was to park off a Forest Service road and hike a few miles in, set up camp by a creek I remembered from a trip a couple of years back, and stay 2 nights. The area had a lot of pine and fir trees, big slopes, and not much undergrowth, so walking off-trail wasn't hard. I figured I'd be completely alone. I started hiking mid-morning and reached the spot I had in mind by early afternoon. The creek was still there, shallow and clear, with smooth rocks under the water. I found a flat spot just above the bank to pitch my tent, with tall trees on all sides and a soft bed of pine needles. Felt good to get the pack off my back. I drank some water, set up my shelter, and got a small fire going. The air smelled like sap and smoke. I didn't see or hear anyone all day, Nothing but squirrels and a few birds moving around in the branches. That first night was peaceful. I stayed up by the fire until it burned down to embers, then climbed into my sleeping bag. It was colder than I expected, but I'd brought the right gear. I drifted off to the sounds of the water and the occasional creak of trees in the wind. I didn't wake up once. The next morning, I made instant coffee and oatmeal, then decided to explore farther upstream. I had the whole day and nowhere to be. I followed the creek for maybe an hour, just taking my time, moving slow and looking around. I saw animal tracks in the soft dirt along the banks. Mostly deer, maybe a fox or coyote. At one point, I heard something moving in the trees uphill from me. I stopped and waited, not making a sound. It went quiet after a few seconds. Probably just a deer. I didn't think much of it and kept walking. I turned around before noon and headed back to camp. I didn't want to be gone too long in case the weather changed. When I got back, everything looked fine. My tent was still standing. Nothing had been touched. I sat by the fire pit and made lunch, just a tortilla with peanut butter and a few pieces of jerky. I stayed around camp the rest of the day, reading a paperback I'd brought and watching the trees. A couple of times I thought I heard faint noises out in the woods, but they were soft and far off. Could have been branches falling or small animals moving. The kind of sounds you get used to out there. I went to bed early that night. It got dark fast, and the clouds covered the moon. I zipped myself into my bag and listened to the creek again, but I didn't fall asleep right away. I had that weird sense, like when you forget if you locked your front door, just a little off. I finally drifted off sometime after midnight. Then I woke up. It was still dark, but not pitch black. My watch said it was just after 3 a.m. I didn't hear anything at first, just the creak. But then I realized something had pulled me out of sleep. I held my breath and listened. There was a soft crunch outside, like a footstep, then another. Slow, steady. I stayed completely still. I didn't bring a gun, but I had a knife. I kept it close when I camped alone. I slid my hand toward it slowly, trying not to make any noise. The steps got closer. Whoever it was, if it was a person, they were moving around the tent, not fast, not trying to hide, just circling. I didn't hear talking or breathing, just the crunch of needles underfoot. I thought about calling out, but decided against it. If someone was messing around my camp in the middle of the night without a light or a word, I didn't want to let them know I was awake. Then the steps stopped. Silence. I waited, gripping the knife, breathing as slow as I could. I didn't hear anything for what felt like 10 minutes, just the wind in the trees and the trickle of the creek. Then the steps started again, farther off this time, heading away from the tent. They faded into the distance until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep again. When the sun came up, I got out fast. I checked around the tent. No footprints, but the ground was dry and covered in needles, so that didn't surprise me. Nothing was missing or disturbed, but I knew what I'd heard. I packed everything quickly. I thought about leaving then, but the rational part of my brain told me it could have been an animal, maybe even a deer. The slow steps, the circling, it didn't feel like a deer. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but I'd set up something to keep watch. A trip line maybe, or some kind of signal if someone came near. I moved my tent closer to the creek, where the trees were thinner and I had more visibility. I rigged up a simple perimeter with a few tin cups and sticks from my gear, placed so they'd fall and clatter if someone walked through. Not much, but it made me feel better. I kept my knife on me all day and stayed close to camp. No hikes. I didn't hear anything strange that afternoon. No steps, no movement. That evening, I built up the fire more than usual and let it burn late. When I finally got into the tent, I left the rain flap open just a bit so I could see out and hear better. I stayed awake a long time just listening. The wind had died down, and the forest was quiet. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. Then the noise came again. Not footsteps this time, just the sound of one of the tin cups falling and bouncing once on the ground. My eyes opened instantly. I stayed still, listening. No wind, no other sounds, just that one clink of metal. I waited. After a minute or two, I heard a soft shuffle, like someone crouching or shifting their weight. I reached for the knife again. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to look, to unzip the tent and shine my flashlight, but I didn't. I kept still. After what felt like forever, I heard the shuffle again, farther off, then silence. I waited until dawn. When I got out, I found one of the cups on the ground, about 5 feet from where I'd strung it up. The stick it had been hanging on was broken. Nothing else looked touched, but that confirmed it. Someone had come back. Someone was watching my camp. That was enough. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't eat or even fill my water. I just got my bag on and started walking. I didn't take the trail. I cut straight through the woods toward the road. I didn't want to risk running into whoever it was if they were still watching. The hike was rough. I kept looking over my shoulder, pausing to listen every few minutes. I saw nothing, heard nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone. It took me almost 4 hours to get back to my truck. When I reached it and saw it untouched, a wave of relief hit me so hard my knees went weak. I unlocked it, tossed my pack in, and drove out without stopping. Back in Boise, I told a friend what had happened, just the basics. He thought it might have been a hunter or some drifter, maybe just curious. But there was nothing in my camp worth stealing. No damage, no obvious purpose. That's what got to me. Whoever it was didn't take anything. They didn't say anything. They just watched. That was my last solo trip. I still go camping, but I stick to busier places now. Campgrounds with other people nearby. Sometimes I'll hear footsteps outside my tent at night. Just someone walking to the bathroom or grabbing something from their car. Normal stuff. But every time it happens, I get that same tight feeling in my chest. I wait, holding my breath, listening to see if they stop, if they start circling. I know most people wouldn't think much of it. No one got hurt. Nothing happened, technically, but that's exactly what makes it worse. The not knowing, the silence, the cup falling in the dark and nothing else. I think about it sometimes when I'm lying in bed, when the house is quiet and the neighborhood's asleep. I imagine those footsteps, slow and steady, moving around the walls of my tent, and I wonder how long they stood there, how long they watched, and why. I'll never go that deep into the woods alone again. It was September of 2018 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip in northern Arizona, near the Coconino National Forest. I was 32 at the time, living alone in Flagstaff and between jobs. I'd just left a stressful position in Phoenix and moved back to where I'd grown up, hoping to reset a little and figure out what I wanted next. I wasn't really looking for some big life-changing moment out there. I just wanted a break from everything. I'd always liked being outdoors. As a kid, my dad used to take me on these weekend hikes and small camping trips in this part of the state. They weren't anything fancy, we'd just pick a quiet spot near the trees and pitch a tent. This trip was meant to be a little like that. Simple, quiet, maybe just 2 nights out there, no distractions. I packed the usual things: a tent, sleeping bag, a small gas stove, food that wouldn't spoil, a good knife, flashlight, water bottles, and a large jug for backup. I also had a satellite phone just in case. I wasn't dumb about safety. The spot I picked was off a forest road that ran about 10 miles into the woods from the nearest highway. There were no marked campsites, but I'd found a clearing on a topographical map that looked flat enough to camp. It sat just above a dry creek bed, surrounded by a mix of pine and oak. I drove in on a Wednesday morning, early enough that the road was still shaded by the trees. The dirt path was rough, but my old Tacoma handled it fine. I parked maybe 100 feet from the clearing and walked the rest of the way in with my gear. Felt peaceful. The sun was filtering through the branches, and there was a slight breeze. I could hear the occasional bird and the rustle of small animals in the brush. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing where the ground was soft but not sloped. After that, I collected some dry wood and set a ring of stones for a small fire, even though I didn't plan to keep it going long. The rest of the day passed slowly. I walked a bit, followed the dry creek bed for a few hundred yards, then circled back when it got too dense with brush. That night was uneventful. I made some pasta over the gas stove and sat by the fire with a headlamp on, reading. I fell asleep sometime around 10, the kind of deep sleep you get after breathing fresh air all day. I didn't wake up until after sunrise. The second day, I went exploring. I took a small backpack, filled it with water and a couple of snacks, and followed a narrow game trail that led east. It looked like deer had used it recently. The trail cut across some low hills and wound through thick clusters of trees. I kept track of my direction with a compass and marked a few trees with a knife so I could find my way back. It wasn't about going far, just far enough to stretch my legs and see something new. I saw some elk droppings and a set of coyote prints, but nothing that made me nervous. I stopped at a ridge around midday, ate a protein bar, then turned back. I was back at camp by 3 in the afternoon. That's when I first noticed something that felt off. My backpack, one I'd left on a stump near the tent, had been moved. Not stolen, just moved maybe 2 or 3 feet from where I'd left it. At first I figured maybe I'd left it like that and didn't remember, but I wasn't the kind of person to toss my gear around. I was careful, especially alone. Still, it wasn't ripped or emptied, so I brushed it off. That night, I didn't sleep as well. I kept hearing noises, which is normal in the forest. Twigs snapping, small rustlings, but this was different. It sounded like something heavier than a squirrel or rabbit. A couple times I sat up in my sleeping bag and just listened. Nothing clear, but I could feel the tension in my neck. Once I unzipped the tent quietly and scanned around with my flashlight. I didn't see anything but trees and brush. No glowing eyes, no movement. The next morning, I was tired and decided I'd pack up and head home early. One night of poor sleep was fine, but I didn't want to push it. I boiled some water for coffee and started packing slowly. That's when I found the footprints. They were faint but clear enough. Not animal, human. Someone had walked around the back side of my tent, stepping in a curved path as if circling. The prints were about the same size as mine, maybe a little bigger, and one of them had a distinct notch in the heel, like a boot with worn-out tread. They weren't mine. I'd been careful to step only in a direct line in and out of camp, and I hadn't walked that close to the rear of the tent. I stared at them for a long time. Now I felt it, the tight pull in my gut, the sense that I hadn't been as alone as I thought. I hadn't seen another person since I left the main road, and this was miles from any trailhead. Whoever had come through hadn't made any noise, hadn't touched anything else, hadn't left a note or sign. They just circled, watching. I packed faster. Tent, gear, food, everything went into the truck in under 20 minutes. I didn't eat breakfast. I just got behind the wheel and drove out. My eyes were on the mirrors the whole time, scanning the trees. I never saw anyone. No vehicles, no hikers, nothing. I got home by noon and took the longest shower I'd had in a while. I felt safe again in my apartment, but the unease didn't go away. That night, I double-checked every lock on my doors and windows. 2 weeks passed. I didn't tell anyone about the prints. I wasn't sure what to say. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe someone passing through. I kept trying to explain it to myself like that. But then something happened that took the situation from strange to dangerous. One afternoon, I got a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. I looked through the peephole and saw a man I didn't recognize. Mid-40s, pale, wearing a dark ball cap. His clothes looked worn and dusty. He wasn't holding anything, just standing there. He didn't ring the bell. He didn't say anything. I watched him for maybe 30 seconds. He didn't move, didn't knock again. I stayed quiet. Eventually, he turned and walked away. I waited another 10 minutes before I opened the blinds. He was gone. That's when I started checking my truck more carefully. Every day after work, I'd look under it, inside it, just to be sure. I even installed a dash cam, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid. I also started going to the gym instead of hiking. It was just a phase, I told myself. I'd go back out eventually, just not yet. A month later, I got a call from a sheriff's deputy. They found a campsite in the woods, less than a mile from where I'd stayed. It had been abandoned, but it looked like someone had been living there for weeks, maybe months. There were tarps, food wrappers, a broken rifle, and a journal filled with odd, fragmented entries. Most of it was unreadable, water-damaged. No ID, no signs of who had been there. The deputy asked if I'd seen anything while camping. I told him about the footprints, but left out the part about the guy at my door. He said it matched with other reports. Hikers seeing strange camps, feeling watched, hearing noises at night. They never found the man. At least not officially. I still think about that trip. I think about how close I was to someone I never saw. Someone who may have been watching me the whole time. And what if I hadn't packed early? What if I'd stayed just one more night? I haven't gone back to that part of the forest. I still camp, but only in designated areas and never alone. I still love the outdoors, but I know now how fast things can shift from peaceful to dangerous. It wasn't a ghost or a monster. It was just a person, and that's what makes it worse. I went on a solo camping trip in July of 2019. I was 34 at the time and working as a warehouse manager in Omaha. I'd gotten burnt out, needed a break, and decided to take a week off. I'd grown up camping with my dad in Missouri, so being out in the woods always helped me reset. My plan was to spend 5 days alone in the Mark Twain National Forest. I'd camp near a small lake called Dry Fork, where I knew there wouldn't be many people. It was the kind of place with no cell signal, no lights, and no traffic noise. Just thick trees, rough dirt roads, and a stillness that most people aren't used to anymore. I prepared well. I had a decent 4-season tent, enough food for the week, 2 big water jugs, a hunting knife, and a satellite beacon in case of emergency. I also brought a folding chair, a couple of books, a small hatchet, and my .357 revolver. I wasn't expecting trouble, but Missouri woods can be unpredictable. Coyotes, bobcats, the occasional black bear. Nothing too dangerous, but still enough to warrant some caution. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was dipping low, and the sky had that soft orange glow that comes before dusk. I parked my truck about a quarter-mile from the lake, where the forest road ended, then hiked the rest of the way with my pack. The air smelled like pine and warm dirt. I could hear the hum of insects, birds calling in the distance, and the occasional splash of water. I felt good. This was exactly what I needed. The first night was calm. I set up my tent in a small clearing about 50 yards from the shoreline. There were some tall cottonwoods and a few thorny bushes on the edges. The lake was quiet, still reflecting the pinkish sky even as darkness crept in. I ate a cold dinner out of a can and watched the stars come out. It was the kind of night where everything felt slow, like time had stretched itself out for me. I went to bed with my knife under my sleeping bag and drifted off easily. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. I made instant coffee and oatmeal over my small stove. I sat in the chair, just listening. No traffic, no beeping phones, just a few frogs near the water and squirrels rustling in the trees. I walked the perimeter of the lake that afternoon. It was about a mile around, and I took my time, stopping to look at animal tracks and plants I didn't recognize. I saw signs of raccoons, deer, and even what I thought might have been a bobcat. Some large paw prints near the muddy edge of the water. I didn't worry too much about it. I had my revolver, and bobcats don't bother people unless they're cornered. That night, I made a small fire. I sat with my feet up on a log and watched the flames for a long time. There was a cool breeze coming in off the lake. I heard owls, maybe a coyote far off, but nothing close. I put the fire out properly, using water and dirt, then double-checked my camp. Everything looked good. I zipped the tent up, lay down, and fell asleep. The second night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft snapping sound, like a twig being broken. I didn't move right away. I just lay still and listened. Came again, but closer. Then I heard leaves crunching. Whatever it was moving slowly, maybe 20 feet from the tent. I reached for my knife and sat up carefully. My tent doesn't make much noise when you move in it, so I stayed quiet. The footsteps circled halfway around the tent and stopped. Then nothing. I waited, holding my breath. The wind had picked up a bit, rustling the trees and masking small sounds. I sat like that for at least 10 minutes before I heard it move away. Slowly at first, then more quickly. I stayed awake another hour, listening. Nothing else came. Eventually, I slept again, though not deeply. The next morning, I looked around the camp. There were no tracks, at least not clear ones. The dirt was dry, and the ground near my tent was mostly covered in needles and leaves. I assumed it had been a deer or a raccoon, something harmless. Still, I didn't like how it had walked around me instead of just passing through. I told myself not to overthink it. That day, I went fishing with a cheap rod I'd brought. I caught 2 small bass and let them go. I tried reading, but I kept thinking about the night before. Every small sound in the woods felt sharper now. I noticed how quiet the birds were by late afternoon. Usually there'd be some calling back and forth, but it was mostly still. I chalked it up to weather. Maybe a storm was coming. That evening, I built another fire. I sat with my back to a tree this time, watching the woods more than the flames. I had my revolver holstered on my belt. I stayed up later than usual, waiting until I couldn't keep my eyes open. Then I crawled into the tent and lay there, fully dressed, with the gun beside me. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I heard the sound again. This time it was clearer. 2 footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching leaves, then silence, then 2 more. I sat up and grabbed the gun. The footsteps stopped right behind the tent, maybe 5 feet away. I held my breath. The thing didn't move for at least a minute. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. Then, just like the night before, it circled slowly, stepping lightly. It went halfway around the tent, then stopped again. Then nothing. I sat still, heart pounding. I thought about unzipping the tent, flashing the light, maybe shouting, but something told me not to. I don't know what it was, but I felt like if I revealed myself, it would change everything. I waited, gripping the gun, listening. Eventually, like before, the footsteps moved away, fainter, then gone. I didn't sleep that night. I waited until the sky started to lighten, then got out of the tent. My body was sore from sitting so tense. I walked the camp again, still no tracks, but I noticed something different this time. One of my water jugs, empty but sealed, had been moved. It had been sitting upright next to a tree. Now it was on its side, about 10 feet away. No tooth marks, no signs of chewing or clawing, just dragged and dropped. That's when I knew it wasn't an animal. Animals don't move sealed containers and walk in a circle around tents. This was someone, person. That afternoon, I packed up most of my gear. I left the tent up and a few things around it to make it look like I hadn't gone anywhere. I didn't want whoever was out there to think I'd caught on. I hiked back to my truck, stashed my heavier stuff inside, and returned with just a backpack and my gun. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat behind a tree 20 yards from the tent, watching and waiting. Around 1:30 a.m., I saw movement, a shape in the dark. It didn't use a flashlight. It walked slowly, crouched low, approaching the tent from the side. I stayed still. My heart was thudding in my throat. The figure stopped near the water jug, looked around, then stepped closer. I could barely make out the outline of a man, thin, wearing something dark. He walked around the tent again, same as before, then stopped at the front like he was deciding something. I raised the revolver and cocked the hammer softly. He must have heard it because he froze. Then he turned his head, like he was listening. I didn't say a word. I didn't move. After a moment, he backed away slowly, turned, and slipped into the trees. I waited until dawn before going back to the truck. I packed everything as fast as I could and got out. I didn't stop until I hit paved roads again. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I got home, I called the ranger station and reported what happened. They took it seriously. A week later, I got a follow-up call. They'd found signs of a camp deeper in the woods, tarps, canned food, and a trail of footprints leading to my old site. No one was there, but it was clear someone had been living out there, maybe for weeks. I don't know what he wanted. Maybe just to scare people. Maybe worse. But I was lucky. If I hadn't been alert, if I hadn't trusted my gut, I might not have made it home. I haven't camped alone since. I still go outdoors, but I take friends now. I choose places with cell service, ranger patrols, and other campers nearby. The forest doesn't feel the same anymore. It's still beautiful, still quiet. But now, I know that silence can hide anything. The sky was already fading into twilight as I pulled into the dusty, gravel parking lot of Pinewood Campground. It was late September, and the air had a crispness that hinted at the oncoming fall. The trees surrounding the campground were beginning to change, their leaves shifting from green to vibrant yellows, oranges, and reds. I was a 32-year-old freelance photographer, and after a long, tiring stretch of deadlines, I decided to spend a weekend out in nature to decompress. I had been to Pinewood before, though it had been years. Back then, I had camped with friends, but this time it was just me. No distractions, no company, just a chance to breathe and focus on something else for once. I grabbed my gear, tent, sleeping bag, food supplies, and camera equipment, and made my way to the campsite I had reserved. It was nestled deep in the woods, not far from the lake that gave the area its name. The campground itself was quiet, which was exactly what I wanted. The few other campers around were scattered far apart, and I could hear the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze as I found my spot. I set up camp quickly, the familiar motions of setting up the tent and organizing my things grounding me in a way that felt calming. The fire pit was just a short walk away, surrounded by a circle of rocks. I unpacked my cooking gear and decided to make a simple dinner, something to help me unwind after the long drive. As the sun dipped lower, casting the world in golden hues, I started the fire. It crackled and popped as the warmth began to spread, pushing back the chill of the evening air. I ate my meal in silence, the only sounds being the occasional crackling of the fire and the rustle of the wind through the trees. I didn't mind the silence. It was peaceful. It was just me, nature, and the crackle of the fire. But as the night grew darker, something shifted. The wind had died down, and in its absence, the world felt still, unnervingly so. I couldn't quite explain it, but it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I felt eyes on me, not literally, but the sensation was there, lurking at the back of my mind. I shrugged it off. It was probably just my overactive imagination. After all, I was in the woods, alone for the first time in a long while. It wasn't unusual for my mind to start playing tricks. As I finished my meal, I started to clean up. I had brought a small lantern to help me see in the dark, so I hung it from a low branch near my tent. The soft light flickered, casting strange shadows around the campsite. Once everything was packed away, I sat by the fire for a while longer, watching the flames dance and sway. The warmth was comforting, but as the hours passed, I started to feel tired. I went into my tent and unrolled my sleeping bag, the familiar rustling of the nylon fabric sounding louder than usual in the quiet of the night. I lay down, pulling the bag up around my shoulders, but sleep didn't come as easily as I thought it would. My mind was racing, the quiet, the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up again, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. I tried to push the thoughts aside and closed my eyes, focusing on the sound of my own breathing. The hours dragged on. I couldn't tell if I was awake or asleep, but I began to hear noises, subtle at first, almost imperceptible. The rustle of leaves, a snap of a twig, a shuffle in the underbrush. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but then I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. A whisper, soft, too soft to make out any words. It was distant at first, but then it seemed to get closer. I sat up quickly, my heart racing in my chest. I strained my ears, listening for the sound again. Nothing, just the wind, or so I told myself. I lay back down, trying to calm my breathing. Maybe I was just hearing things. The woods were full of sounds. Animals, wind, the creaking of branches. It was all normal, right? But then the whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't in the wind or the rustling leaves. It was just outside my tent, so soft I could barely hear it, but it was unmistakable. I held my breath, trying to make sense of it, but the words never came through. Just a hiss of breath and a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping outside. The fire had died down to a low glow, casting eerie shadows across the campsite. The air was colder now, the kind of chill that cut through to your bones. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the trees and the open space around me. Nothing, just the quiet hum of the night. I walked a few steps away from the tent, my footsteps crunching on the dry ground. The forest felt unnaturally still. Not a single sound, no animals, no insects, nothing. It was as if the world had gone completely silent. I shined the light through the trees, but I couldn't see anything. No movement, no sign of whatever had caused that whisper. For a moment, I just stood there, listening to the complete silence. It was unnerving, like something was waiting, watching, just beyond the light. I shook my head and walked back to my tent, telling myself I was just tired, that I had imagined the whole thing. It had to be the case. But even as I lay back down, I couldn't get rid of that feeling, that something was out there, just beyond the edge of the light, waiting. Sleep eventually came, but it wasn't restful. My mind raced with thoughts of the strange whisper and the unsettling quiet. I woke up several times throughout the night, each time feeling like I wasn't alone. Each time, I would force myself to breathe deeply, calm my racing heart, and convince myself that it was just my nerves. When the sun finally rose, I emerged from the tent, rubbing my eyes and blinking in the early morning light. The campground was still eerily quiet, but the sun's warmth helped ease the lingering unease. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my camera and set off down a trail that wound through the trees, leading toward the lake. As I walked, the forest seemed to come alive. Birds sang overhead, and the occasional squirrel dashed across my path. I felt my tension ease with every step. The woods weren't so frightening in the daylight. They were beautiful. I snapped pictures along the way, capturing the morning light filtering through the trees and the vibrant colors of the leaves. It was peaceful. But then, as I neared the lake, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A trail of broken branches and crushed leaves. Someone had been walking here recently. And not just someone large, someone heavy. The marks were fresh, the ground disturbed. I knelt down, running my fingers over the broken twigs. The trail led deeper into the forest, toward a part of the woods I didn't recognize. I stood up, my mind racing. Who would be out here this early in the morning? I thought about the whispering I had heard the night before, and a chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone, not entirely. I decided to follow the trail, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the need to know what was out there, or maybe it was just my curiosity. The further I walked, the more the air seemed to change. The trees grew thicker and the forest grew darker. The path became less clear, and I had to push my way through brush and vines. Then, as I rounded a bend, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. A makeshift camp. There was no one around, but the signs were unmistakable. A tarp hung loosely between two trees, and an old, worn backpack lay discarded on the ground. It was abandoned, but it hadn't been here long. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. I looked around, but the area was silent, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. After a moment of hesitation, I decided to turn back. My curiosity was now replaced by unease. I wasn't sure what I'd stumbled upon, but it was clear I didn't want to find out anymore. The trail back to my campsite felt longer than it had before, and the silence pressed in on me, making every step feel heavier. When I finally returned to my tent, I didn't waste any time packing up. I wanted to leave, to get out of the woods and back to civilization. The fear of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the trees, was too much to ignore. I didn't know what had happened out there. Maybe it was just another camper. Maybe it was nothing at all. But one thing was clear. I wasn't sticking around to find out. I drove away from Pinewood Campground as quickly as I could, and when I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a diner for breakfast. I ordered a coffee and sat down, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that still clung to me. And then I saw it. A local newspaper on the counter with the headline, "Missing person found dead in Pinewood Forest." I didn't need to read the article to know what had happened. The hair on my neck stood up, and I didn't order another cup of coffee. I left the diner and never looked back. It was late September, and the trees in the Adirondacks were starting to show the first signs of fall. The air was crisp, a reminder that summer was leaving and winter would soon be taking its place. I needed to get away from the noise and the stress of the city. Everything about my life in New York had felt like a blur of deadlines and obligations, so I decided to head out alone, to the woods, where the only sound would be the wind in the trees. I was 28 years old, and I'd been camping a few times before, but never alone. It felt like the perfect opportunity to disconnect. I planned to stay in a remote area, far from any campsites or roads, deep into the heart of the forest. The idea of complete solitude was what drew me in the most. It wasn't about the adventure or the thrill of the unknown. It was the quiet, the calm, and the feeling of being at peace with myself for the first time in a long time. I packed my gear carefully. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small camp stove, food, water, a flashlight, and my trusty pocket knife. Everything I would need for a weekend away from civilization. I parked my car at the trailhead and set out on foot with the hope of finding a secluded spot by the lake that I had read about online. The hike wasn't difficult, but it was a long one. The trail was narrow and winding, filled with thick trees and a carpet of fallen leaves. The sounds of birds and rustling branches surrounded me, but it was all peaceful. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The place was just as beautiful as I had imagined. A small, tranquil body of water surrounded by towering pines and mountains in the distance. I found a spot on the shore, cleared away some underbrush, and set up my tent. The sun's fading light made the whole scene feel like a painting. The water was still, reflecting the colors of the sky. It felt like the perfect place to unwind. I spent the evening gathering firewood, and as the fire crackled and burned, I sat back and watched the flames dance. There were no other campers around. It was just me, the fire, and the stars above. I had no plans to leave the tent tomorrow, just a day to enjoy the quiet, maybe read a book, and catch up on some much-needed rest. It felt like a luxury. The first night in the woods was exactly what I needed. The only thing that disturbed me was a faint sound in the distance, like a twig snapping underfoot. I looked up at the darkened trees, wondering if it was an animal, but the sound didn't come again, so I chalked it up to my imagination. The fire died down, and I crawled into my sleeping bag, letting the cool night air lull me to sleep. I woke early the next morning, well before sunrise. It was cold, and the frost on the ground crunched under my boots as I stepped outside. The air smelled fresh, earthy, like the kind of air you only get in the wilderness. I started a small fire again and brewed some coffee, the warmth of the cup seeping into my hands. I had a vague plan to explore the area around the lake, but had no real agenda. It felt good to just be here, disconnected from the world. I packed up a small bag with snacks, water, and my knife, and set out for a hike along the shoreline. The landscape was stunning. I was deep in the forest, and aside from the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, everything was silent. The lake stretched out before me, dark and still, and the woods around it seemed untouched by time. A few hours into the hike, I reached a small, hidden cove, sheltered by overhanging trees. It was the kind of spot that felt private, like it was meant just for me. I decided to sit for a while, take in the scenery, and just enjoy the solitude. I didn't know it then, but this was the moment when everything started to change. I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was a shadow moving through the trees, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. I chalked it up to the movement of the branches in the wind. The day was getting warmer, and I felt like I had the entire forest to myself. But the peace I had been enjoying started to fade as a faint unease settled over me. It wasn't anything tangible, but the feeling lingered. I started to walk back to camp, but by the time I reached the edge of the lake, I felt like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I quickened my pace, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the sense of unease grew stronger the closer I got to the camp. It was like the woods themselves were closing in on me, making it harder to breathe. When I returned to my camp, I stopped dead in my tracks. My tent was gone. Not just the tent, but all my gear, the fire pit, Everything was disturbed. It wasn't just the wind. Someone or something had been there. I stood frozen for a long moment, not sure what to do. I thought about what might have happened. Maybe it was a prank by other campers or someone else passing through. But there was no sign of anyone nearby. I looked around the area, trying to see if anything had been left behind, but there was nothing. My heart began to race, and my mind started to spiral. The silence of the forest felt oppressive now, not comforting. I checked my backpack, and to my relief, the food, water, and essential items were still there. But everything else, the tent, the stove, the firewood, was gone. I knew that whoever or whatever had taken it wasn't far. The thought of being stranded out here, in the middle of nowhere with no shelter, was terrifying. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. I made the decision to head back to the trailhead. It wasn't an easy decision. It was late afternoon by now, and the hike back would be long and tiring, but I couldn't risk being out here alone any longer. As I gathered my things and started to walk, I noticed something strange. The trees seemed to be closer, as though the forest had grown denser in the short time I had been away. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, and the wind had picked up, howling through the branches. It was as if the forest itself was pushing me out. The further I went, the more the feeling of being watched grew. The sense of danger was palpable. By the time I reached the edge of the woods, it was getting dark. I didn't dare stop to rest, knowing I had to make it to the trailhead before nightfall. My legs were aching, my mind racing. Every step I took felt like it was taking me further into something I didn't fully understand. When I finally reached the trailhead, exhausted and disoriented, I saw a light up ahead. It was a flashlight bobbing in the distance. Relief flooded over me as I recognized the figure walking toward me. It was another hiker, someone who had been out in the woods for the weekend. He was friendly, and we exchanged a few words, though my mind was still too frazzled to have a full conversation. He had no idea about the strange things that had happened, and I didn't explain them. The trailhead felt like the edge of the world, the safety of civilization just beyond the trees. I didn't go back to the campsite to see what had happened. Something in me told me I wasn't meant to know. All I could think about as I drove away was the feeling of being watched, the unsettling sensation that something had been out there in the woods, something I couldn't see. But I made it out. That's the important part. I made it out. The woods are big, and they can be dangerous, but they are also beautiful, and I would go back one day. Just not alone. Not without knowing more about what I was getting into. Because there are things in the forest, things that you might not understand. You're never truly alone out there. It's dark when I pull my truck into the small, secluded campsite. I'm in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. It's the kind of spot you only find if you know exactly where you're going. There's no cell service here, no other campers. Just me, the trees, and the quiet hum of nature around me. This is supposed to be a getaway from everything, a break from the noise of my life. But as I step out of the truck, something doesn't feel right. I can't put my finger on it at first, just a slight unease that sits heavy in my chest, but I ignore it. The year is 2024, and I'm 32 years old. I've been camping plenty before, but there's something about this place that unsettles me. The sky is clear, stars scattered across it like diamonds, but the air is a little too still. I try to push that feeling aside as I unload my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and the essentials. The only sound is the crunch of gravel under my boots and the rustling of the trees as I move around. I set up the tent quickly, the whole process familiar. I'm well versed in how to make camp and do it in a way that's comfortable, practical. I get the fire pit ready, gather some wood from the pile nearby, and start a fire. The crackling flames light up the immediate area, casting long, wavering shadows against the trees. It's peaceful here, in this tiny, isolated corner of the forest, but that feeling of unease won't go away. The crackling of the fire is the only thing that cuts through the silence. Once the fire is going, I sit back on a rock near the edge of the camp, watching the flames dance in the cool night air. The forest around me seems alive, full of noises I can't quite place. There's the occasional snap of a branch, but I tell myself it's just wildlife. Deer, maybe, or a raccoon, small creatures going about their business. I've spent enough time in the woods to know the sounds, but tonight, it feels like something's off. After some time, I pull out a book from my bag, hoping it will take my mind off the nagging feeling in my gut. But even as I try to read, my eyes keep darting to the trees, scanning the darkness between them. It's like there's something there, just out of view, lurking. The shadows are deeper tonight, stretching longer than usual, almost as if they're moving closer to the fire. I shake my head, frustrated with myself for being so jumpy. I've camped alone plenty of times before. I've hiked for miles through dense woods and slept under the stars without a care in the world. But something about tonight feels different. When the fire begins to die down, I grab more wood and feed it into the flames. The night is cold now, and the warmth of the fire is a welcome comfort. The flickering light makes the trees around me seem alive, their trunks twisting and stretching in the shadows. I stare at the flames, trying to focus on something, anything, to distract myself. But then, from the corner of my eye, I see something move in the trees. It's quick, just a flash of movement, but it's enough to make my heart skip. I look up, my eyes scanning the dark outline of the forest, but I don't see anything. My breath catches, and for a moment I think I imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind, the way the branches shifted. I tell myself to relax, but the sensation of being watched doesn't go away. It's like someone, or something, is just outside my camp, hidden in the darkness, waiting. I stand up and walk over to the edge of the camp, my eyes trained on the trees. Nothing. Still, I can't shake the feeling. It's like the woods themselves are holding their breath, waiting for something. I spend the next few hours staring into the night, trying to push the anxiety away, but it keeps building, creeping into the edges of my thoughts. By midnight, the fire has dwindled down to just a few glowing embers. The sky above is pitch black, the stars distant and cold. I'm sitting by the fire, wrapping myself in my jacket, when I hear a noise. It's faint at first, almost like a soft rustling. Then it comes again, louder this time, a crack of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I freeze, my body stiffening as I listen. It's too close to my camp to be an animal. The noise is deliberate, heavy, and slow, like something or someone is moving through the woods, trying to stay hidden. My heart starts racing. I don't move, afraid that any sound I make will give me away. The crackling of the fire is the only noise now, but it seems impossibly loud. I wait. Nothing happens. The forest falls silent again. Maybe it's nothing, I think. Maybe it's just the wind playing tricks on me, but I can't shake the feeling. The air is thick now, oppressive, and it feels like the trees are closing in around me. I get up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. I grab my flashlight and shine it toward the woods, scanning the area. There's nothing, just trees and shadows. But I'm not convinced. Something is out there. I decide to stay close to the fire, not wanting to venture into the woods on my own. But the unease only grows. The quiet feels unnatural now, like something is wrong. I sit down again by the dying fire, trying to breathe through the rising panic in my chest. As I sit there, I notice something strange. The shadows in the trees seem to be moving. They're not just flickering with the firelight, but actively shifting, as if something is making them move. My eyes are playing tricks on me. I tell myself that it's just the wind. Then I hear it again. This time it's much closer. A soft scraping sound, like something dragging across the forest floor. My heart slams in my chest, and I stand up, my body trembling. I point the flashlight into the darkness, but I don't see anything. Then, without warning, I hear something heavy, like footsteps, crunching through the leaves, coming from the far side of my camp. My stomach drops, and I know, without a doubt, that I am not alone. I don't know what to do. Panic rises in my throat, and I feel the fight or flight instinct kicking in. My brain tells me to run, but my legs won't move. I stay frozen in place, staring into the woods, waiting for whatever is out there to show itself. The steps stop. The silence is deafening. I don't dare move, don't dare breathe. My flashlight is shaking in my hands, the beam bouncing across the trees, but I don't see anything. No movement, no shapes, just darkness. Then a crack, a loud, sharp snap of a branch, and I feel my pulse racing again. It's right there, just beyond the circle of light. Something is watching me. I take a deep breath and force myself to move. I grab my bag and the essentials, my knife, my map, and stuff them into my pack. I need to leave. I can't stay here any longer. I turn toward the truck, my mind made up, when I hear it again. A voice, a low murmur, too far away to make out the words, but close enough to make my skin crawl. The voice sounds human, but something about it doesn't sit right. I grab my keys and start walking quickly toward my truck, every step feeling heavier than the last. The camp feels wrong, like it's suffocating me, and the air is thick with something I can't explain. I get to the truck and slam the door shut behind me, my hands shaking as I start the engine. The engine sputters to life, and I quickly throw it into gear, peeling out of the campsite, leaving the small, secluded area behind. The road is bumpy and narrow, but I don't care. My heart is racing, and my mind is clouded with fear. I don't look back. I just drive, faster and faster, until I finally reach the main road and can see the lights of the nearest town ahead. I pull into the gas station, my hands still trembling as I turn off the engine. I sit there for a moment trying to catch my breath, but I don't feel any better. My skin is cold, my heart is pounding, and the feeling of being watched hasn't left me. It's still there, lingering at the edges of my mind. I don't know what happened out there in the woods. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was something else. But I won't be going back. I don't care how peaceful it looked at first. There's something wrong with that place. I can't explain it, but I know that I'll never forget the feeling of being watched. Never forget the sound of those footsteps, that voice in the dark. And I'll never forget the silence that followed it. I was 34 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in the northern part of Idaho, close to the Canadian border. It was the summer of 2021, and I had been working from home for over a year due to everything that had happened in the world. My job as a graphic designer had me glued to a screen day and night, and I had started to feel completely disconnected from everything that wasn't digital. I hadn't been outdoors in months, and I missed it in a way I couldn't explain. I picked a spot about 3 hours outside of Sandpoint, a remote area near a river I found on an old hiking forum. It wasn't part of any national park, just public land people used if they knew about it. The guy who posted about it said he'd been there twice and hadn't seen a single person either time. That's exactly what I wanted. Silence, nature, just me and the woods. I had done solo camping before, though not in a place this isolated. I packed enough food for 5 days, brought 2 power banks for my phone, even though I didn't expect signal, a foldable solar charger, a water filter, and all my gear. I left my car parked a few miles down an old dirt road and hiked the rest of the way in. It took me about an hour and a half to reach the riverbank, where I set up camp. There were no trails or signs, nothing but thick woods and silence. The river wasn't big, but it moved fast and clear. I found a small flat area under some tall pines and set up my tent. Felt perfect. By the second night, I had settled into the rhythm of it. I fished a little, made fires, cooked simple meals, read a paperback book, and sat watching the light change through the trees. The first 2 nights were uneventful. A few distant animal sounds, rustling in the brush that was probably a deer, nothing unusual. It was on the 3rd day that I started noticing small things that didn't feel right. I woke up that morning and found that my cooking pan, which I had left leaned against a rock by the fire pit, was missing. I thought maybe I had put it somewhere else without realizing it. I checked all around the area and eventually found it about 15 feet away, lying upside down next to a bush. That didn't make any sense. I hadn't moved it. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I knocked it over the night before and it rolled somehow. Still, it felt strange. Later that day, I went to refill my water from the river and found fresh footprints in the muddy bank near where I'd been filtering water. They weren't mine. I could tell because the treads didn't match my boots, and they were heading upstream, away from my camp. They looked fresh, not more than a few hours old. I stood there staring at them, trying to figure out how someone else could be out here. I hadn't seen anyone since I left the road. I had checked the area before setting up and hadn't noticed any signs of other people. No gear, no sounds, nothing. I followed the tracks for a little while, maybe 20 minutes upstream, but they faded quickly once the ground got drier. There were no other signs of anyone. No campfire, no tent, no garbage. Just those prints. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was probably just a hiker passing through, but something about it felt wrong. Why would someone hike through this area without camping? Where did they go? That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every little sound made me sit up in my sleeping bag. I kept listening for voices, footsteps, anything, but it was quiet, too quiet. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination getting the best of me. I was deep in the woods alone, and it was normal to feel on edge. But even then, something felt different. The next morning, I noticed something else. My pack had been unzipped. Not all the way, just enough to tell someone had been looking through it. Nothing was missing, but it wasn't how I left it. I always zipped it shut tight before going to sleep. That's when I knew it wasn't animals. No bear or raccoon is going to unzip a pack neatly and leave it otherwise untouched. This was a person. That's when I decided I'd leave the next morning. I had planned to stay 5 nights, but 3 was enough. I didn't like the idea of someone wandering around near my camp in the middle of the night, not saying anything, not making their presence known. It wasn't just strange, it was threatening. If someone else was out there, sneaking around instead of saying hello or making noise, they were doing it on purpose. I didn't want to find out why. I spent that day double-checking everything, packing what I could early, making sure my gear was dry and ready. I didn't hike out because I didn't want to do it tired or in the dark. I'd wait until first light and head back to the car. That night, I didn't even start a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I sat in my tent with my headlamp off, listening. Around midnight, I heard it, slow, steady footsteps crunching leaves not far from my tent. I froze. I didn't move, barely breathed. The steps got closer, then stopped. For a long time, I didn't hear anything. Then I heard something scrape against the side of my tent. Just a faint dragging sound. My stomach turned. I had no weapon, just a utility knife and a small hatchet I used for splitting firewood. I reached for both, slowly, trying not to make noise. I sat there, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. I wanted to scream, to yell, but I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I waited like that for what felt like forever. Eventually, the sound faded, and the steps moved away. I didn't sleep after that. I waited until the first hint of light and packed everything in 15 minutes flat. I didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't even take down my tent properly. I just stuffed it all into my pack and left. The hike back felt twice as long. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I kept checking over my shoulder, certain I'd see someone following me. I didn't, but when I finally reached the spot where I had left my car, I found something else. My rear driver's side window was cracked open about an inch. I know I didn't leave it like that. I always lock the car completely and double-check it, especially out here. Nothing inside seemed disturbed, but it still rattled me. Whoever was out there had been close enough to find my car. That meant they had probably been watching me from the beginning. I drove straight back to Sandpoint and got a motel room. I sat under the shower for half an hour, just letting the hot water run over me. That night, I didn't sleep much either. I kept replaying the noise outside my tent, the footprints, the pack being unzipped. Someone had been watching me close for days. I don't know what they wanted. They didn't take anything. They didn't hurt me, but they got close. Too close. I thought about reporting it to the local sheriff, but what would I even say? There was no crime, no proof. Just a story about someone creeping around the woods. I decided not to. I didn't want to go back out there to explain where it happened or show them the spot. It's been over 3 years now, and I haven't gone solo camping since. I still camp, but only in state parks where there are rangers and other people. I still think about what happened sometimes, especially when I'm falling asleep in a tent. The woods are beautiful, but they're also wide open. No locks, no doors, no walls, just thin nylon and shadows. I think that's what scared me most. Not what I saw, but what I didn't see. That someone was out there, close enough to watch me, maybe even close enough to touch my tent, and I never even saw their face. Whoever they were, they didn't want to be seen. They wanted to watch, to get close without being noticed. And they did. But I got away. I didn't stick around to find out what they wanted. I don't think they expected me to leave so fast. If I had stayed one more night, maybe I wouldn't have had the chance. That's what I think about the most. How close I came to something I'll never really understand. And that's enough. I don't need to know who they were or what they were doing out there. I'm just glad I left when I did. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do in the woods is to pack up and walk away. I was 34 when I decided to take some time off from work and go on a solo camping trip. It was the fall of 2019, and things in my life had been feeling too fast, too loud, and too crowded. I worked in logistics in Pittsburgh, always staring at spreadsheets and schedules, always checking emails late into the night. I wanted to be somewhere quiet, somewhere I didn't have to check my phone or think about deadlines. I picked a spot in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I'd been there once before with some college friends years back. I remembered the long trails, thick woods, and how spread out everything was. This time, I planned to stay off the marked campgrounds and hike deeper in to a more remote place. I had a good tent, solid boots, and I knew my way around the woods well enough. I packed food for a week, a big water filter, and the usual gear: knife, tarp, matches, flashlight, GPS, and a battery pack. I also brought a small hatchet. I wasn't expecting trouble, but I liked having something with weight in my hand if I ever needed it. I left my car in a trailhead lot near Seneca Creek Trail, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The trail was familiar at first, winding through soft pine beds and rolling hills. It wasn't long before I veered off and headed southeast, away from the hikers and closer to the old fire road I'd seen on a topo map. I wanted space. I wanted quiet. I found both. By the second afternoon, I was miles from any real path. The woods were thick and silent except for the sound of wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of small animals. I picked a flat spot near a stream to set up my camp. I made sure to set it well above the waterline in case it rained. I cleared the ground of sharp rocks and sticks, pitched my tent, and built a small fire pit with rocks. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you feel in your chest, like a warm pressure. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I hiked during the day, took photos of the changing leaves, and sat by the fire at night with my headlamp and a paperback. I didn't see a single person. I liked that. I felt like I had the forest all to myself. On the 3rd day, I decided to hike farther out just to explore. I left my tent and gear where they were and followed the stream for a couple miles, marking trees with small strips of orange tape so I could find my way back. I saw deer, some turkey, and a lot of scat that looked like it came from coyotes. Nothing unusual. Around midday, I came across something strange. At first, I thought it was just trash. A few metal cans scattered in the brush. But when I got closer, I saw that they were old. Real old. Rusted through in places, covered in moss. Some still had faded labels I couldn't read. Then I noticed more. An old pot, a broken lantern, the frame of what might have once been a cot. All of it almost swallowed up by the forest. I realized I was standing in what used to be someone's campsite, decades ago probably. There was no structure, just some flat stones that might have been a fire ring and more junk scattered in the underbrush. I poked around for a while, careful not to touch anything too unstable. Then I found something that made my stomach turn a little. A torn piece of canvas with what looked like dried blood on it. It was brownish, could have been old paint, I told myself, but it looked too much like blood. I stepped back and decided I'd seen enough. Something about that place felt wrong. Not haunted or anything, I don't believe in that, but more like the kind of wrong you feel in your gut when you walk into a room where a fight just happened. Like the tension sticks to the air. I turned back toward my own camp, checking the orange tape every 100 feet or so. About an hour later, I was back at my tent. Everything looked fine at first. My tent was still up. My food bag was still hanging from the tree I'd strung it on. But when I got closer, I noticed the tent zipper was halfway down. I was sure I'd closed it. I knelt beside it and looked in. My sleeping bag was pushed to the side. One of the gear bags inside was unzipped, and some of my things were out of place. Not stolen, just moved. My flashlight was on top of the sleeping bag instead of inside the side pocket where I kept it. A pair of socks I'd left in a stuff sack were outside the bag entirely. It looked like someone had searched through it. I stood up fast and turned around, scanning the trees. I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear anything either, just leaves in the breeze. The woods were so quiet it made my ears ring. I took the hatchet from the side pocket of my pack and held it while I walked a slow circle around the clearing. I didn't see any fresh tracks or signs of someone passing through. No broken branches or flattened grass. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I lay in my tent, fully dressed, with my headlamp strapped to my head and the hatchet beside me. I barely slept. Every noise made me sit up and hold my breath. I heard twigs snap a few times, but that could have been anything. Still, my nerves were shot by morning. When the sun came up, I packed fast. I didn't eat. I didn't make coffee. I just shoved everything into my pack and started walking west, back toward the trailhead. I planned to be back to my car by nightfall, but around midday, I realized something was off. The orange tape I'd tied to the trees on the way in, some of it was gone. Not all of it, just some. Enough to confuse me. I stopped and tried to remember the terrain. Had I gone the wrong way? I checked my GPS. The battery had died. I swore under my breath and dug for my battery pack. It was gone. I knew I'd packed it. I emptied my whole bag. It wasn't there. Now I was scared. Not just uneasy, but really scared. Someone had been in my camp. They'd taken something without me knowing. And now someone had pulled down the markers I used to find my way. It wasn't a coincidence. I wasn't alone out here. I kept walking anyway. I knew the general direction I needed to go, and I was still near the stream, which flowed west. I followed it even though it made the hiking slower and rougher. At least I wouldn't get turned around. That afternoon, I found more signs that someone had been messing with me. A pile of rocks that hadn't been there before. For smooth stones stacked neatly in the middle of the path I'd just come down. I stopped and looked around again. I couldn't hear anything but the stream and my own breathing. I wanted to shout, to yell out and see if anyone would answer, but something deep in me told me not to. Whoever was out there didn't want to be seen. They wanted to scare me, and it was working. I pushed hard through the rest of the day, only stopping to drink from the stream and catch my breath. My legs ached. My feet were soaked. By evening, I was still in the woods, and the light was dying. I found a narrow, rocky rise that gave me some elevation and climbed it, hoping to see something that looked familiar. What I saw instead chilled me. On the opposite ridge, maybe 200 yards away, was a figure, just standing there between the trees. I couldn't see their face or even details of their clothes, just the shape of a person, standing completely still, watching. I dropped down behind a rock and didn't move. I stayed there for a long time, watching. When I finally looked again, the figure was gone. I moved on, now fully on edge. I didn't stop that night. I walked through the dark with my headlamp off, using just the faint moonlight and the sound of the stream to guide me. I was so tired I was stumbling, but I didn't want to stop. I felt like stopping would be a mistake, a big one. Just before dawn, I found the old fire road I'd seen on the map. I almost cried with relief. It was overgrown but still recognizable. I followed it west, hoping it would eventually lead me back toward the trailhead or at least somewhere closer to help. After a couple more hours of walking, I finally saw something beautiful. A brown wooden sign, faded but legible, pointing toward the main trail. I was almost out. I made it to my car by late morning. It was untouched. I got in and locked the doors immediately. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station with a store about 30 miles away. I bought a charger, plugged in my phone, and called my brother to let him know I was okay. I didn't tell the police. I didn't know what to tell them. I didn't see a face. I didn't have any proof. Nothing was stolen that I could prove, and I hadn't been attacked. But something had happened out there. Someone wanted me gone, or scared, or lost. And they had succeeded. I haven't been camping alone since. I still go hiking, but only on well-used trails. I always tell someone where I'm going, and I always carry a second backup battery. I've thought a lot about that trip, about the missing markers, the moved gear, the person on the ridge. I'll never know what their plan was. Maybe it was just a sick game. Maybe they just liked the control, the power of scaring someone without ever being seen. But I got out. I made it home, and that's all that matters. It was the summer of 2019. I was 34 years old and had just quit my job at a logistics company in Tampa. I had some savings put aside, and after years of working long hours and barely getting time for myself, I needed a break. I wanted to disconnect from people, phones, meetings, and emails. I'd always liked the outdoors, and camping had been something I used to enjoy when I was younger. I figured it was the right time to get back into it. So I packed up my old Ford Escape, loaded a tent, sleeping bag, basic gear, a small cooler, and enough supplies for a few days. My plan was to head up into northern Georgia, near the Chattahoochee National Forest, where I had camped once before when I was a teenager. I didn't have a specific campsite in mind. I looked at maps, did a little research, and decided I'd find a spot away from the more popular areas. I wasn't interested in being near RVs, families, or loud weekend groups. I wanted to be alone, deep in the woods, away from everything. I drove about 8 hours and reached a small, winding road that broke off from the main route. It wasn't paved. There was a rusty sign with faded letters, Forest Access Road 128. It looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. That was perfect for me. The road was rough, full of ruts with weeds growing up the middle. I took it slow, bouncing over potholes, scraping the undercarriage more than once. After about 40 minutes, the path opened into a small clearing surrounded by trees on all sides. There were no markings, no signs of anyone having camped there recently. It was perfect. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air was cooler than I expected, crisp, with that earthy smell of pine needles and damp soil. I could hear birds, the faint sound of a creek nearby, and the wind moving through the leaves. I spent the first few hours setting up camp. I pitched my tent near the edge of the clearing, close to a cluster of large rocks that could serve as a makeshift seat or table. I gathered some dry wood, made a small fire pit with stones, and laid out my food and gear in an organized way. I wasn't in any rush. The sun was still up, and I had no plans but to enjoy the quiet. That first night was peaceful. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, ate slowly, watched the stars come out. It was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing, the occasional snap of a twig from some animal passing through, and nothing else. It was what I had hoped for. I slept deeply that night, wrapped in my sleeping bag, with only the sounds of nature outside. The next morning, I woke up early, just as the sky was getting light. I made coffee with my portable stove and sipped it while watching the sun rise through the trees. There was a chill in the air, but it felt good. I decided I'd spend the day exploring. I took my backpack, filled a couple bottles of water, packed a granola bar, a knife, and my compass, and started hiking in a random direction. I marked trees with small notches using my pocket knife, just in case I lost track of the way back. The woods were dense, full of life, and untouched by people. After a couple of hours, I came across an old overgrown path. It wasn't marked on my map. It looked like it might have once been used by hunters or maybe old forestry workers. I followed it out of curiosity. It led me deeper into the trees, down into a small valley, and past what looked like an old hunting blind. It had collapsed in on itself, moss and leaves covering the roof, almost blending it into the forest. It was strange seeing something man-made way out there. I snapped a photo of it with my phone but didn't think much of it. Just part of the woods reclaiming what was left behind. When I turned to head back, I felt something off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The air felt still, heavier. The woods suddenly felt quieter than before. I waited for birds or rustling in the bushes, but there was nothing. I tried to shrug it off, figured maybe it was just the time of day. I took out my compass, oriented myself, and started walking back toward the direction I'd come from. But something was wrong. I passed a tree I could have sworn I had already marked, but the notch wasn't mine. It looked older. I walked faster, checking the trees, trying to find my trail. I realized I had veered slightly without noticing, and now I wasn't exactly sure where I was. I tried to stay calm. I knew panic would only make it worse. I checked the time. It was 2:30 in the afternoon. Still plenty of daylight. I kept walking, scanning the forest carefully. Eventually, I came across one of my own notches. I let out a breath of relief. I followed them back, slowly but surely. Took me about an hour and a half, but I made it to camp. When I got back, I noticed something strange. My small cooler had been moved. It was about a foot from where I left it. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe I had knocked it without realizing earlier. That night, I stayed up a little later than usual. I kept the fire going longer. There was a weird feeling in the air. I didn't see or hear anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. I went to bed eventually, more alert than the night before. Every little sound outside made me open my eyes. I didn't sleep well. In the morning, I saw clear tracks in the dirt near my fire pit. They were human. Boots, maybe size 10 or 11. Not mine. I stood there for a while, staring at them. They came in from the north side of the clearing and circled the tent once. They didn't go toward the cooler or the gear, just around the tent. Then they led off back into the woods. I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Someone had been near me while I was sleeping, watching. I hadn't heard a thing. No breaking twigs, no rustling, nothing. I packed up quickly that morning, planning to head out. I didn't want to deal with whatever this was. But as I started loading my gear into the car, I realized my keys weren't in the front seat where I always left them. I tore the place apart, checked every bag, every pocket, the ground, the tent, even inside my sleeping bag. Nothing. My keys were gone. I tried not to panic, but it was hard. I sat in the driver's seat trying to think. I had no signal, of course. I was too deep in the woods for that. I could try walking back toward the main road, but it was miles away, and I wasn't sure I could find it again without driving. I still had supplies and water, but not much. I decided to stay one more night and look for the keys in the morning. Maybe I had dropped them during the hike and just hadn't realized. I spent most of the day retracing my steps around the camp and into the nearby woods. I didn't go far. I was too nervous now. Every sound made me freeze. At one point, I thought I saw movement through the trees, but when I looked again, it was gone. Could have been a deer. Could have been something else. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept the fire burning until it was just embers. I sat with the flashlight in my lap, eyes fixed on the dark. Nothing happened, but that didn't make it better. The not knowing was worse. When the sun came up, I was already walking. I decided to follow the footprints from the day before. They led deeper into the woods. I knew it was risky, but I couldn't just sit around and wait. I followed them slowly, carefully, marking my path so I wouldn't get lost again. After about an hour, I found something that made my stomach drop. Hanging from a branch about 6 feet off the ground, dangling from a piece of thin wire, were my car keys, just swinging gently in the breeze. Someone had taken them and hung them there, deliberately, for me to find, or as a warning. I didn't wait to find out. I snatched them and ran. I didn't care about the gear I left behind. I just wanted to be gone. I got in the car, started it, and drove down that terrible road as fast as I could without wrecking. The whole time, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out into the road. No one did. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near the highway. I sat there for almost an hour, shaking, drinking warm soda from a vending machine, trying to calm down. I didn't report it. What would I even say? There were no signs of a crime. No one to accuse, no damage, just a terrifying experience with no explanation. It wasn't illegal to walk in the woods. It wasn't illegal to hang keys from a tree. But I knew what happened. Someone was out there, watching me, maybe just messing with me, maybe planning something worse. I still don't know. I haven't been camping since. I don't think I ever will again. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I'm alone or when I hear a sound outside at night. Not because of ghosts or monsters, just because I know now that people can be worse, especially the kind of people who live out in places where no one else goes, and they don't need a reason. I was 32 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the northern part of Idaho. It was July 2021, and I had just taken time off from a job I'd been grinding at for nearly 8 years without a proper break. I'd been feeling burned out and irritable all the time, and I thought being alone in the woods, away from emails and traffic and other people, might help straighten my head out. I didn't want campgrounds or RV parks or anything like that. I wanted real isolation, just a tent, my pack, and a few days of total quiet. I found a spot on satellite maps that seemed perfect, about 15 miles off any major road, not marked with any trails. Just a small clearing next to a winding creek that eventually fed into the Salmon River. The access road wasn't even on the GPS. It was more of an old fire trail than a road, overgrown and barely wide enough for my truck. But it was manageable. I parked in a small pull-off about half a mile from where the trail vanished into the forest and loaded up my pack. It was hot and dry, and the hike in wasn't easy. I was sweating through my shirt within 10 minutes, and the bugs were bad in the thicker brush. But the woods were beautiful. Tall lodgepole pines, long stretches of dry needles underfoot, birds everywhere. The further I got from the road, the more the quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. It was the first time in years I felt like I could actually breathe. The clearing was even better than it looked on the map. Maybe 50 yards across, hemmed in by dense forest on 3 sides, and a rocky creek curving around the 4th. The sound of water was constant, clean, steady. No trash, no fire rings, no signs anyone else had camped there. Just silence and wildness. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough to hear the creek but far enough not to get wet if it rained. I kept things simple: 1-person tent, sleeping pad, bag, stove, some freeze-dried meals, and a water filter. I brought a bare canister for food, and I stored it 100 feet from the tent like you're supposed to. I spent that first evening walking around, checking out the terrain, gathering deadfall wood for a fire. I wasn't planning to burn much, but the fire gave me something to look at, something to do with my hands. The temperature dropped fast once the sun dipped behind the trees. I sat beside the fire, listening to the insects hum in the trees and watching shadows creep slowly across the clearing. When it got too dark to see my hand in front of my face, I crawled into the tent and lay back on my bag, letting my mind empty out. That first night was peaceful. I woke up once to pee, and the stars were so bright it looked fake. No clouds, no moon. Just black sky and cold air and 1,000 points of light over the treetops. I remember thinking it was the quietest I'd ever heard the world. The next morning, I filtered water from the creek and made instant oatmeal. I decided to follow the creek upstream for a while just to explore. I brought my day pack, a knife, a flashlight, and a few snacks. I wasn't expecting to be gone long. The creek ran uphill through a narrow gully, and I had to cross it a few times, hopping from rock to avoid getting wet. I saw elk tracks, scat, even what looked like cougar prints in the mud, though I wasn't completely sure. The sun filtered through the trees in shifting patterns, and the further I walked, the less I thought about work or my phone or any of that crap. I followed the creek maybe 2 miles before turning around. On the way back, I saw something weird. A tree maybe 20 feet tall, stripped of all its bark on one side. The wood underneath was torn and gouged, almost like claw marks, but not clean. More like chunks had been ripped off by something. There were splinters on the ground. I bent down and looked at it, trying to figure out if it was a bear marking its territory or something else. But it looked too aggressive for that, like something had been trying to break the tree apart. There were also prints nearby, boot prints. Not mine. Someone else had been walking there recently, but they were deep, like the person was heavy or carrying something big. I suddenly felt exposed, standing there in the trees, far from camp, far from my truck. I listened, but heard nothing. No footsteps, no movement, not even birds. That silence made the hairs on my neck stand up. I made my way back to camp faster than before, checking behind me now and then. Nothing followed me. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. The tent, the fire pit, even the wood I'd gathered. Still, I felt off. Not scared, exactly, just unsettled. I kept turning around, thinking I'd see someone standing just beyond the trees. I didn't, but the feeling didn't go away. That night, I didn't make a fire. I cooked in silence, eating with my back to a tree so I could see the clearing. I didn't hear anything strange, but every little snap or rustle made me twitch. At some point, I realized the insects had gone quiet again. No crickets, no frogs, just the creak and the sound of my own breath. I went to bed early but didn't sleep much. Sometime after midnight, I woke to a noise. Not a branch falling or an animal walking. Something sharper, like metal clinking against metal. I froze, listening. Then it came again. Faint, distant, but real. A sound you don't expect in the woods. Stopped, then started again. I unzipped the tent as slowly as I could and peeked out. There was nothing in the clearing. No lights, no movement. I waited 5 minutes, then got out, barefoot, and crept toward the trees. The sound was coming from deeper in the forest, back the way I'd come earlier that day. I couldn't see anything, but the sound was regular. Tap, scrape, tap, scrape. I stood there for what felt like half an hour, not moving until it finally stopped. I didn't go back to sleep. The next day, I packed everything up. I hadn't seen anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby, watching. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was overthinking things, but I knew better. That sound wasn't an animal. It was a person doing something. Maybe a hunter, maybe a hiker, but something felt wrong. I loaded my gear and hiked back toward the truck. The trail looked different on the way out. Bushes bent the wrong way, branches freshly broken. At one point, I found a boot print on the trail, but it was pointing toward my camp. Not away. That was enough. I kept moving. When I got to where I'd parked, the first thing I noticed was that my truck wasn't how I'd left it. The driver's door was open just an inch. I know I locked it. I always do. I dropped my pack and ran the last few steps. Nothing looked stolen, but someone had been inside. Glove box open, papers scattered, like they were looking for something. I checked under the truck, behind it, everywhere. No one was there. I jumped in and started the engine without thinking. The moment it turned over, I backed out of the brush and drove until I hit pavement. Then another 2 hours before I stopped to breathe. A week later, I reported it to the sheriff in that county. He didn't seem surprised. Said that part of the forest sometimes attracts off-grid squatters or guys running illegal grow-ops. He said the signs I saw, tree damage, prints, my truck being tampered with, sounded like someone trying to scare me off. He told me I was lucky they hadn't done worse. I haven't gone back since. I still camp sometimes, but only in known places. Trailheads, state parks, places with rangers and other people nearby. I miss the quiet sometimes, the true stillness of that forest. But I also remember the silence that came with it. Not peaceful, but dead. Like something was watching and waiting. What really gets to me is that I never saw whoever it was. Never heard them speak. Never found a campsite or trash or anything. Just signs. Just a few things left behind to let me know I was not alone. And that was enough. I went camping alone in the summer of 2017, up near a quiet stretch of woods just outside of Glidden, Wisconsin. I was 27 back then, living in Eau Claire, working full-time at a small roofing company. I didn't get much time off, but I had managed to block out a 4-day weekend and decided I'd use it to unwind. I didn't want to go anywhere crowded or commercial, just a quiet place in nature where I could breathe. I didn't want to deal with anyone. I didn't even tell my coworkers or friends exactly where I'd be. I just said I was heading north, which I thought was enough. I had done a lot of hiking and camping before, so I figured I'd be fine. I picked a spot I'd read about in an old hiking forum, a little clearing about 3 miles off a decommissioned logging road. It didn't have a name. I found it by cross-referencing a bunch of maps and satellite images. It was surrounded by thick woods, bordered by a stream on one side and some small rocky hills on the other. The kind of place that never sees more than a couple of people a year. That's what I wanted, solitude. I parked my truck at the end of the logging road, tossed my backpack over my shoulder, and started the hike in. The first half-mile was pretty easy, an old, overgrown trail. After that, it was more of a bushwhack. I had a handheld GPS, a paper map, and a compass, and I took my time. I got to the clearing in the late afternoon. It was just like the forum post had said, peaceful, quiet, and flat enough for a tent. There were no signs of recent visitors, no footprints, no trash, no cut branches. Just me and the woods. I set up my tent under a cluster of pines, about 20 yards from the stream. The ground was soft and covered in pine needles. I cooked some instant rice and tuna on my little camp stove, ate while sitting on a log, and watched the sky turn orange through the trees. I felt completely at peace. The air was cool, the bugs weren't too bad, and the sound of the stream was calming. That night, I slept hard. The next morning, I got up early and walked upstream for a few hours. I found a nice flat rock and just sat there, listening to the water. I saw a few deer in the distance, heard a woodpecker, and even spotted a fox darting between some fallen trees. It felt like the kind of day I'd remember forever. I came back to camp around midday, made some coffee, and took a short nap in my tent with the flap open. When I woke up, something felt off. Nothing specific, just this subtle tension in the air. I tried to shake it off. I made myself walk down to the stream, splash some water on my face, and force myself to enjoy the moment. I told myself I was just tired, maybe a little dehydrated. But as I walked back to camp, I noticed something small and strange. My folding knife was open and sticking in the ground near the fire pit. I hadn't left it like that. I remember standing there for a full minute, just staring at it. I always kept it closed and clipped to my pack. I wasn't sure if maybe I'd used it earlier and forgotten, but that didn't feel right. I checked my bag, it was unzipped. Everything was still inside, but the zipper was open halfway down. I tried to tell myself I must have left it like that, but I knew I didn't. That night, I didn't sleep as well. Every sound outside the tent had me sitting up and holding my breath. The wind in the trees sounded like whispers. Once or twice I thought I heard footsteps, but they were too faint to be sure. I finally dozed off around 3 a.m., clutching the knife in my hand inside the sleeping bag. When I woke up the next morning, the flap of my tent was wide open. I hadn't left it that way. I know that for a fact. I had zipped it shut from the inside. My boots were sitting outside, side by side, but turned around, like someone had taken them off and placed them backward. That did not happen by accident. I packed up fast. I didn't cook breakfast. I stuffed everything into my pack, grabbed my water bottle, and took off down the same path I came in on. My heart was racing. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves had me spinning around. I kept thinking I'd see someone following me, but I never did. I got back to my truck by early afternoon. The gravel near the wheels was disturbed more than I remembered. A few pine needles had been caught under the windshield wipers. My gut was screaming that someone had been there while I was gone. I started the engine, locked the doors, and drove out of there without stopping once. I should have gone home, but I didn't. I drove into Glidden and booked a cheap room at a rundown roadside motel. I needed to be around people. I took the longest shower I've ever taken and sat on the bed for hours, just trying to sort through everything. I didn't feel right. Not sick exactly, just off, like I'd been watched for days. That night, I kept the lights on and barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard a soft knock on the door, just once. I froze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I waited for it to happen again. Didn't. I stayed up until the sun came up. When I left that motel the next morning, I drove straight to a sporting goods store and bought a trail cam. I drove all the way back to the edge of the logging road. I couldn't bring myself to hike back in, but I left the camera on a tree near where I'd parked the first time. I angled it toward the trailhead and set it to record motion-triggered clips. 2 weeks later, I drove back up to get it. The camera was still there. It hadn't been touched. I took it home and went through the footage. Most of it was just squirrels, birds, and branches swaying in the wind. But there was one clip that made my stomach turn cold. It was from the third night I'd been out there. Around 1:47 a.m., a man walked past the camera. He wasn't carrying a flashlight. He moved slow, quiet. He wore dark clothes, baggy enough to hide his shape, and a hood pulled over his head. He walked with a limp. He never looked at the camera, just walked across the frame, then vanished into the woods. It was only a few seconds, but it felt like an hour. I called the county sheriff's office. I didn't know what I expected them to do. They said they'd look into it, but didn't sound too concerned. Said it was probably some hunter or local who wandered through. But that didn't explain my knife, or the open tent, or the way my boots had been turned around, or the knock at the motel. I didn't go camping again that year, or the year after that. I sold my tent, stove, and most of my gear. I started checking the locks on my doors 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a night. For a while, I thought I saw that same man in crowds or across the street. Just quick flashes of someone who looked similar. It always turned out to be someone else, but it messed with my head. That took me almost 3 years to go out again. And when I did, I didn't go alone. I went with 2 friends, both armed, and we stayed in a public campsite with other people around. I still don't like sleeping outside. Not really. I don't think I'll ever camp alone again. Whatever happened out there in those woods, it wasn't a bear or a trick of the mind. It was someone who had been watching me, someone who waited until I fell asleep, someone who got close enough to unzip my tent and stand over me. And the scariest part is that they didn't take anything. They didn't hurt me. They didn't leave a note or make a noise. They just let me know they were there. I had been planning the trip for a few weeks. The idea was to get away from everything, work, city noise, people, and just breathe in the quiet. I needed the kind of silence that only the woods could give. I picked a spot in northern Minnesota, somewhere near Grand Rapids, but not quite that far north. It was the fall of 2019. I was 31 then, working construction jobs mostly. That week had been rough. I needed the trip like a man needs sleep after 3 days awake. I loaded up my old Ford Ranger with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, propane stove, water jugs, some freeze-dried meals, a hatchet, and my .357 revolver. I always brought it on solo trips. Never had to use it before, but it gave me peace of mind. I had a topo map printed off from an old hiking website with some handwritten notes about a clearing near a small lake. No cell reception was expected out there. That was part of the appeal. I drove out on a Friday afternoon, the kind of drive where the trees slowly start taking over and gas stations become rare. About 2 hours from home, I turned onto a gravel road that narrowed more with each mile. The road was in rough shape. I passed 2 other trucks parked on the shoulder miles apart, probably hunters. I kept going until the road turned into more of a trail. Eventually, the truck couldn't go further without taking damage, so I pulled off into the brush and hiked the rest of the way in with my gear on my back. It took maybe 45 minutes to reach the lake. The place was perfect. The clearing was soft underfoot, a mixture of pine needles and moss. The lake was calm and dark, with trees pressing close to the water's edge. No signs of other people, no trash, no fire pits. I felt like I had found a place that hadn't been disturbed in years. I set up the tent facing the water, about 15 feet from the shoreline. The sun was getting low by then, throwing gold across the lake surface. I boiled water for dinner and watched the colors fade. That night, I stayed up a little longer than I meant to, just sitting and listening. There were crickets, the occasional splash of a fish jumping, maybe a frog. It was cool but not cold, and I fell asleep without much trouble. I woke up sometime after midnight. I couldn't say what woke me, but I remember that I didn't hear anything at first, just silence. The kind of silence that isn't peaceful, but tense. I sat up inside the tent and listened. The forest should have been alive with sounds, especially in the fall, but it was dead quiet. I thought maybe a predator had passed through. That happens. Sometimes when a big animal moves through, the rest of the forest shuts up. I waited, hand on the revolver next to my sleeping bag, until eventually I heard a branch crack. Not close, maybe 30 feet off, deeper into the trees. It didn't happen again. After a few minutes, I lay back down. My heart took a long time to slow down, but eventually it did. I drifted back into sleep. The next morning was uneventful. I cooked a small breakfast and drank some instant coffee, then went for a walk along the edge of the lake. I found signs of deer, tracks in the mud, fresh scat. Nothing strange. Around mid-afternoon, I heard an engine way off in the distance, probably someone else hunting. It reminded me that even out here, I wasn't completely alone. That night, I kept the fire going a little longer. I think the quiet from the night before had gotten to me more than I realized. I sat with the revolver on my lap, just staring into the flames. Nothing happened, though. No strange sounds. I turned in before midnight and fell asleep fast. But I woke again around 2 a.m. This time it was different. I heard something breathing, not right next to the tent, but close enough that I could hear it. It was slow, heavy breathing, not panting, not sniffing, just steady, like someone trying to stay calm. My body locked up. I didn't unzip the tent. I just grabbed the revolver and sat frozen, barely breathing myself. It lasted about 2 minutes, then stopped. I didn't hear anything walk away. No footsteps or rustling, just breathing, then nothing. When the sun came up, I forced myself out of the tent. I looked around the campsite carefully. No tracks, no broken branches, no disturbed soil. I walked a full circle around the clearing, but everything looked undisturbed. I was starting to think I imagined it. Maybe I had a bad dream. Maybe it was an animal, but one smart enough to keep quiet. Still, something didn't feel right. I almost packed up and left. I stood by the lake holding the tent fly in one hand, just staring at the water. I didn't want to leave like that, scared, uncertain. I told myself I'd stay one more night, but I'd keep the fire going and sleep lightly. I set up a second pile of dry sticks ready to throw on the flames if it started to die. That evening, I sat with my back to the fire and my eyes on the tree line. I didn't eat. I didn't move much. Every little sound made me turn. At one point, a squirrel darted out of a bush and I almost raised the gun. I felt stupid. It was probably nothing, just a trick of the wind or a raccoon. Around 10 p.m., I heard something again. This time it was slower, soft footfalls, not close, maybe 50 feet back in the woods. I stood up quietly and tossed more wood on the fire. The sound stopped. I stayed standing for a long time, straining to hear anything. But the forest stayed quiet. No more steps. I decided not to sleep in the tent. I sat next to the fire with my back against my backpack and the revolver in my hand, resting across my lap. I kept the fire alive all night. Around 3:30 a.m., I started to nod off. My head would droop, then jerk up again. It was getting colder. At some point, I heard movement again, something crunching a dry leaf. This time it was closer. My eyes snapped open and I held my breath. The fire crackled, but the sound didn't come from that. It was from the left side, maybe 10 feet into the woods. Then it was quiet again. I slowly lifted the revolver and pointed it toward the sound. I didn't move otherwise. I waited maybe 10 minutes before I saw a shape. Not clearly, just a shadow that didn't belong. It was low to the ground, but tall. At first I thought it might be a bear, but then it stood up. It was a man crouching in the dark, watching me. I stood fast and raised the gun. He didn't move. He just turned and disappeared back into the trees without a sound. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before I grabbed my backpack and dumped it into the tent, grabbed the tent bag, and started taking it down without folding it. I threw everything in a bundle and marched straight back toward the truck. I didn't look back. I moved fast but steady, with the revolver in one hand and the gear slung over my shoulder. The sky was just starting to lighten. I reached the truck in about half an hour, heart pounding the whole time. I threw everything in the bed and got the hell out of there. I didn't even stop to strap it down. When I hit the paved road, I finally locked the doors, though I didn't even remember unlocking them before. I drove straight to a diner near a highway junction and sat for an hour drinking coffee. My hands were still shaking. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't even know what I'd say. I thought about reporting it, but what would I tell them? A man crouched in the woods watching me? That's not illegal. Creepy, sure, but not against the law. I didn't have a plate number. No description, just a shape in the dark. Still, I didn't go camping alone again for almost 2 years after that. I told myself it was probably a hunter. Maybe someone out there doing something sketchy. Maybe he thought I was someone else. Maybe he was just as scared of me. But I couldn't get that moment out of my head. The way he just crouched there, staring, unmoving, for so long. No flashlight, no gear, no sound. Just eyes in the dark and the feeling of being watched like prey. Whatever his reason was for being out there, it didn't feel like he had one that made any sense to me. He wasn't there to enjoy nature or hunt. He was waiting, watching. He came back more than once. He stayed silent, even when I knew he was just feet away. And I knew if I hadn't stayed up with the fire that night, if I had gone to sleep thinking everything was fine, I might not have heard him again. I might have woken up with him right outside my tent, or maybe not at all. I'm more careful now. I still camp, but only in designated areas or with friends. I bring more than one weapon. I bring trail cameras too, not because I'm paranoid, but because I learned something that weekend. The woods don't care who you are. And sometimes, the scariest thing out there isn't an animal or a storm. It's another person, just quiet enough to blend in.